1. The van sailed down the highway. Charlie laughed out loud and slapped the side of his weighty GMC G20 while Lindsay cranked up the music. "I love this song," she yelled over at Amy and Jerry, who were busy rolling a joint in the back seat. Shelly sat looking out the window, shooting darting glances in Lindsay's direction. The whole reason she had agreed to come on this stupid trip in the first place was that she thought it would give her and Lindsay a chance to talk. "Shit!" Charlie yelled and slammed his fist onto the dash. Red and blue lights flared up behind the van. Jerry ran his hand through his dark brown hair, his hands flailing out trying to hide the weed. Amy quickly shoved it into her bag, hoping that the cop hadn't noticed their frantic movements as he walked up alongside the van. Shelly buckled her seatbelt, and some others followed suit. Charlie just kept shaking his head. Shit, he was so screwed. If his dad found out, he was dead. Charlie's dad had made it pretty clear that as long as he was paying for his son's education, then Charlie was under no circumstances allowed to party off campus. Especially not over spring break, when his father was sure he'd get into trouble. So the last thing he wanted to do was have to call his dad over a possession charge. Not to mention, he would then have to explain why he was out here. The officer slammed the door of his cruiser and straightened up his flat-brimmed hat. He saddled up beside the van, tapping on the driver's window. "License and registration," he said, his accented voice paying homage to his handlebar mustache. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" Charlie asked, trying not to sound as nervous as he felt. The officer looked up from Charlie's license and registration. "You see that sign back there?" he said, looking into the vehicle at the others. From the look on his face, he didn't like what he saw. "Yes, officer," Charlie replied, licking his lips. Jerry and Amy were visually sweating in the back seat. "Well, it says the speed limit is 45. You all were going 60. That's a no-no around here. I'm going to have to give you a speeding ticket." He went back to his cruiser with Charlie's license and registration. Charlie exhaled. He hadn't even realized he was holding his breath. A speeding ticket was nothing. He could just pay that online and not have to worry about his dad finding out and taking the van away. "Jesus," Lindsay said. "You guys need to pull your shit together. If you guys are this bad, practically sober, how do y'all think you're going to handle some hallucinogens?" "We're trying to, man. I just keep sweating for some reason," Jerry said and starting giggling, causing Amy to crack up too. "Yeah, and that cop came out of nowhere," Amy added, doing her best to catch her breath and stop laughing. "That's because you guys are both stoned," Lindsay said dryly, crossing her arms. "Being mean to them won't help anything. Besides, it's just a speeding ticket, and it wasn't their fault," Shelly said. "Tell that to my insurance company." Charlie huffed, tapping his fingers on the dash. He really wished that officer, deputy or whatever would just hurry and give him his ticket so they could get out of here. The officer made his way back to their car. "Look, I ran your plates so I know you guys are out-of-towners, so I'm only going to say this once. We like things quiet around here. So I expect this to be the last time we gotta meet like this." "Of course, officer, you won't be hearing from us again. I promise you that," Charlie replied. The officer stared at him, and then at Jerry and the others. "I hope so. You all have a nice day now. And keep out of trouble," he said, making his way back to his cruiser. Charlie waited for him to leave, and then started the van up and pulled out onto the road. "Maybe watch your speed, Charlie, for real," Lindsay said as they got going again. Charlie just shook his head. What was up with that cop, though? Giving us the small town, we don't like outsiders speech. He joked. "Maybe he just likes things quiet, man," Jerry replied, making a shushing sound that caused Amy and him to fall into another fit of laughter. "Guys, look how big the trees are out here," Shelly said, gazing out of her window and looking out at the large pines that surrounded either side of the country road. "It looks so foreboding," Amy said a bit too loudly, her voice echoing through the van. "We are now entering the Forbidden Forest," Jerry pantomimed, giggling and falling off his seat. Lindsay just stared at them. The look on her face was priceless, and even Shelly couldn't help but join in on the laughter. "And what are you laughing at, Shelly?" Lindsay said, looking at her. "I can't seem to remember why you're even here." "Oh, lay off, Lindsay," Charlie said. "What happened to you two? You guys used to be inseparable." Lindsay huffed back into her seat, crossing her arms over her ample chest. Shelly also looked away. Amy was too busy throwing pretzel sticks into the air, trying to get them into Jerry's mouth, to even realize the level of tension in the van. "Come on guys, don't make a mess," Charlie groaned, flinching every time Jerry missed a pretzel, knowing that he'd still be finding stray pretzel sticks around the van for the next couple of months. Jerry popped another pretzel into his mouth. "Okay, cool out, man, me and Amy can clean it out tonight." Charlie swirled around in his seat. "If you think I'm leaving the van unlocked so Amy and you can fool around in it, you've lost your damn mind. Watch the fucking road," Lindsay yelled. Charlie turned back around in his seat and swerved over, back into the correct lane. "Cool out, Lindsay," he said. The ride was mostly quiet after that. "Hey Shelly, do you want some pretzels?" Amy asked. "No, I'm okay thanks though," Shelly said. Amy just smiled at her, lost in a haze. Charlie turned the van onto a small dirt road that was cloaked in the evergreen shade of large knobby pine trees. They were silent, enjoying the serenity of their surroundings as they pulled up in front of the cabin. Shelly couldn't help but notice that the cabin seemed to be little more than a shack, a compilation of sun-bleached wood and a large rusty red metal roof. It wasn't at all like what Charlie had talked it up to be. Charlie smiled at them. "Welcome to paradise," he said with a small chuckle. The cabin belonged to Charlie's uncle as part of one of his outdoor recreation areas. It came equipped with everything a middle-aged man would deem necessary in a one-bedroom cabin, a living room that doubled as a kitchen with a propane stove and top combo that looked like it from an old RV, and of course, an outhouse. "You don't expect me to have to use that, do you?" Lindsay asked, pointing to the outhouse. The others didn't look enthusiastic about it either. Jerry and Charlie just laughed as they continued to unload the van. "Hey guys, where are we all sleeping?" Shelly asked. "Lindsay and I will take the bedroom and you guys can camp out in the living room," Charlie said with a wink. "In your dreams, Charlie," Lindsay said, already grabbing her bags out of the van. "Yeah, all the cool kids in the living room. Have fun playing with yourself, old buddy," Jerry blurted, making everyone crack up. Charlie and Jerry started cracking open beers while putting the rest into a refrigerator that was a glorified cooler that ran on a solar power. Lindsay continued to huff as she went through the cabin. Her lip curled up into a sneer. Shelly wanted to say something, anything to her, but she wasn't quite able to find her voice. "All right guys, I think it's time to go out into the woods and get what we came for," Charlie said, giving Jerry a high five. Shelly was confused. "I thought you guys were kidding about that shit," she asked. Lindsay looked at her. "When has Jerry ever kidded about drugs? Besides, it might be fun," she added, glancing away from her. "What types of hallucinate whatever are we looking for? Like mushrooms?" Shelly asked. "Not quite," Jerry replied. "Yeah, we came out here for monkshood," Charlie said. Jerry learned about it in his folklore lectures. "Wolfsbane?" Shelly asked. "Exactly, it's supposed to give you a total mental trip, pagan style," Jerry said. "And you guys are sure it's out here, right?" Lindsay asked. Charlie rubbed her shoulders. "Yeah, my uncle told me about seeing a bunch up here while he was hunting." Lindsay shrugged his hand off. "Yeah, I looked it up in the library back at school. The shit out here is supposed to be extra special," Jerry said. "Now you all heard the man. Grab what you need and let's head out before it gets dark." 2. The woods around the cabin were immense. Surrounding the cabin was what felt like a never-ending sea of pine trees. A far cry from what they'd left behind in the city. With the sun already sinking low beneath the clouds, Jerry had decided that now was the time to go looking for his weird-ass herbs. Shelly tried her best not to trip as she walked, How they were supposed to find one plant in the middle of all this was beyond her. For all she knew, they'd already passed what they were looking for. All these plants looked the same. How in the world were they supposed to tell one plant from the other? She wondered. Charlie and Lindsay were a little ahead of her, walking side by side just a couple of steps behind Jerry and Amy. Lindsay was still ignoring her. Great. The only reason she'd agreed to come on this trip in the first place was so they could finally talk about what happened. Maybe this entire trip had been a bad idea. She couldn't help but think after she stumbled for the 50th time over a small shrub. After all, it didn't look like she and Lindsay were ever going to get to talk, especially with her making a point of not giving them a minute alone. And the only time she opened her mouth in Shelly's direction, it was just to yell at her or make a snide comment. They giggled up ahead, and Shelly almost stumbled again. She ran to catch up with them, noticing that in her reverie she'd fallen behind. Lindsay looked over at her. "I thought we had lost you." She almost looked a little disappointed that they hadn't. It was getting really dark, making the woods seem even more foreboding than they did in the light. "Hey, I think it's time to head back," Charlie said, pivoting around and sending his beer sloshing out of the can, soaking the front of his t-shirt. "Damn, we should probably come back out tomorrow when there's more light," he told them, still trying to wring out his shirt. "I don't even know what these stupid things are supposed to look like," Lindsay huffed. "Why couldn't you guys just bring shrooms?" she asked Jerry, exasperated. "Because the whole point is to do something we haven't all done before," he said, slowing down so he wouldn't outpace them. "You know, have an experience and try something new?" he asked sarcastically and turned around, completely missing the awkward look that Shelly and Lindsay gave each other. Jerry and Amy turned their back on the group and walked farther out into the woods. "Jerry, are y'all coming in?" Lindsay called out to them. "No, we want to, keep looking a little more, you know," he replied as he and Amy started giggling again. "Well, at least someone's getting lucky on this trip," Charlie muttered, looking between the other two girls who weren't paying him any attention and stomping back to the cabin to change his shirt. "What's wrong with him?" Shelly asked. Lindsay shrugged. "I think he just realized that he's in for a chilly night alone." They both laughed. "Hey, look, I think we need to talk, Shelly started, but Lindsay turned away coldly and hurried back towards the cabin, leaving her standing there mid-sentence and causing her to have to run to catch back up. Charlie was already there, grabbing some cut wood off the pile out back before heading in. He handed his beer off to Shelly, who held it for him with a tired sigh while he gathered up as much wood as he could. She could only watch as Lindsay disappeared inside the cabin. Opening the door, she realized they were all in for a chilly night as the temperature in the surrounding forest plunged. Her phone, which barely had one bar, said the surrounding area was supposed to get down into the 40s. She hadn't even thought to pack warmer clothes, and from the way the others were shivering inside the cabin, they hadn't either. Charlie took his beer back and sat down by the wood stove to get a fire started. From the look of it, though, they would not have one soon. "Why doesn't your uncle just get regular heat in here? It's not like he couldn't afford it," Lindsay asked. "I think he likes the idea that he's roughing it," Charlie replied as the kindling finally caught. "But to be fair, I doubt the crazy bastard has even spent an entire weekend out here. I think he just likes to say he has it, you know?" Lindsay and Shelly both shook their heads. Charlie just shrugged. He wasn't drunk enough yet to explain the weirdness of middle-age masculinity, yet. After giving up and finally throwing lighter fluid on it, Charlie finally got a fire started. The flames slowly ate at the larger pieces of wood. Closing the stove door, Charlie said, "And that's how you make a fire, ladies." "Took you long enough," Lindsay said, smirking at the way Charlie deflated, which caused them both to laugh. "At least it's getting warm now." "Thanks, Charlie," Shelly offered, feeling bad for poor Charlie. "You are most welcome, Shelly. I'm glad someone here appreciates my efforts," he said, cracking open another one beer and passing out some to the others while he was at it. Shelly sipped hers, lightly not really liking the taste of the cheap pilsner they had grabbed at the gas station on the way down. Not that she was a big beer drinker in the first place. Bad? Lindsay said with a chuckle. Maybe, Shelly murmured. Ask me again after the soapy aftertaste fades. She replied dryly. Don't worry about it. The more you drink, the better they get. Charlie, who was steadily chugging them down, was just glad that Shelly and Lindsay were talking again, even if only a little at a time. The ride down had been almost painfully awkward, with both girls ignoring each other. And while he knew he wasn't the brightest guy, even he wasn't dumb enough to get in between two women fighting. That was suicide. He was slightly upset they had turned him down so harshly though. Usually, they were nicer about it. Lindsay had walked to the other side of the room, while Charlie sat in one of the rickety wooden chairs his uncle had around. Shelly groaned in delight as she stretched out on the couch, not even minding the enormous dust cloud that shot up as she did, sipping more of the beer and hoping that nothing had crawled out between the cushions. Charlie had been right. The more she drank, the better they got. And the less creepy the cabin seemed. Maybe this was going to be fun after all. Even Lindsay seemed to loosen up. What's this for, Charlie? Lindsay asked, looking at the two metal hangers that were screwed in on either side of the door. Charlie looked up. See that thick 2x4 next to the door? He asked, pointing to where it lay beside the door. Yeah, Lindsay replied. Well, that goes in there to bar the door. He replied, prodding the fire again and causing a cascade of sparks to fall out on the floor. He stamped them out with his sneakers. Why would your uncle need to bar the door? Shelly and Lindsay asked together incredulously. Charlie looked up at them like it was simple. You know, bears. Wait, there are bears out here? Shelly asked. Well, yeah, we're in the woods and that's where bears live. Duh. Charlie replied, shaking his head and laughing. Hey numbnuts. Lindsay started in on him. Wouldn't that have been something you should have told us? Nah, they just get curious about doors and stuff and try to come into the cabins around here. I mean, who would be stupid enough to mess with a bear? He asked. Jerry and Amy are still out there, Shelly replied. The color drained from Charlie's face. Well, shit. 3. Jerry and Amy were entwined with each other on a blanket under a massive pine tree. The dead pine tags under them let them lay comfortably on the ground. Amy pulled herself closer to him, mostly for warmth. It's getting cold. Maybe we should head back, she said. They had already finished fooling around, plus they had found some of what they were looking for. More than enough for all of them to trip balls. Maybe or we could do some of this shit now before we have to share with everyone else, he said, holding up 2 purplish flowers in the palm of his hand for her to see. Won't they get pissed? Amy said, rolling off of him and deeper into the pine boughs. Besides, didn't you say that it looks different from the one in your class? It's a little off, but it's definitely a strain of Wolfsbane. So either way it should make us trip balls. He replied with a laugh and tickled her. She pushed her away. I'm being serious. What if you're wrong? We're in the middle of freaking nowhere. He took out the small hooded flowers, at least 20 or 30 in all. He rolled them back and forth in his hand, thinking about the best way to take them. Then he smiled over at Amy and popped some bulbs in his mouth, chewing rapidly to work the flowers up into a paste in his mouth before swallowing. He hoped it would create the same reaction it did when brewed into a tea. What the hell, Jerry? You're supposed to boil it into a tea. How do you know those damn things aren't poisonous? She asked, alarmed. It will be fine. I'm just speeding up the process. Do you want some? He asked, holding out his hand. No, let's get back in case you get sick. Jesus, it's like you don't even think sometimes. She replied and began putting her clothes back on. Lucky for him, the forest hadn't stayed dark. As the full moon had risen, they could see more and more as their eyes adjusted. More than enough for him to appreciate Amy naked in the pale moonlight. Looking at her and feeling the warmth of the drugs in his system, Jerry couldn't help but think how lucky he was. Jerry followed suit and packed up their blankets back into their bag. He put the rest of the monk's hood into a smaller plastic bag he had brought, so it wouldn't get destroyed on the way back. After all, that would have defeated the purpose of the trip. The ones he had found had been a bitch to get. He didn't like the prospect of having to find more if anything happened to the first batch. Amy had her arms crossed in front of her, and even in the dim light of her down-turned flashlight he could see the curls of long dark hair and enough of a pout on her lips to know that she was pissed at him. Damn. Maybe he should have double-checked the strain back at the cabin. He had a book back in the van that had a picture they could have compared it to. He went over to comfort her, but as he moved around, he almost fell. His head spun and then he was feeling nauseous. Shit was the only word that came to mind. Hey, I think it's kicking in, he said, holding on to a nearby tree for support. His stomach rocked and roiled, like it was unsure which direction it wanted to flow. What is it like? She asked, coming over to him and rubbing his back. Are you going to be okay? I feel like I'm going to be sick, so it's probably going to kick in soon, he said, his lips going dry and his mouth getting a cottony sensation. Amy went from being mad to being worried in an instant. Jerry was usually good at handling his shit. But this time he looked really sick, and even worse than that, he actually looked worried. She could count on one hand the number of times she had seen her easygoing boyfriend actually get worried about something. All of those had been pretty terrible occasions. She was not enjoying the prospect of trying to find the way back to the cabin with Jerry out of his mind. But it was clear that he couldn't make it back on his own. The forest seemed to close up on her then, as she struggled to pull Jerry through the forest. He was hunched over and seemed to be on the point of puking. Am I going the right way? She asked him. I don't know, he said. I was too busy paying attention to your ass in those jeans, he said with a weak laugh. Amy gave his shoulder a squeeze. It's all good, Casanova. Mama will get you back to the cabin, she said, feeling less confident in her navigating abilities than she had a few moments ago. The path narrowed and gave way to an opening, and just through it, she could kind of make out what she thought was the cabin. Large plumes of smoke came up through the trees to help them find their way. They must have got the stove going, she realized. Hey, we are almost there, she told him, trying to sound reassuring. Jerry was lathered in a cold, sick sweat, and it was making it hard to hold on to him. His skin had taken on an oily sheen that made her feel like she was trying to hold on to a fish. He made a sound that may have been a reply. Whatever it was, she couldn't make out his slurred speech. Shit, Amy said aloud. She slapped his face to make him more responsive. Wah, he mumbled groggily. She shined the flashlight on him and swore. His skin had taken on a sickly pallor, and he was visibly sweating freely. Jesus, Jerry, your pupils are the size of dinner plates. I don't feel so hot, babe, he muttered lamely. She swore again. He was too heavy to carry by herself. She would have to get Charlie to help her carry him back. Damn it, so much for a fun vacation. She knew that if they couldn't get Jerry to puke that shit up, they were going to be taking a trip to the hospital tonight. I'm going to lay you down and get Charlie, okay? I can't drag you there by myself, she said. Amy was getting nervous. She prayed that the monk's hood wouldn't kill him. She put her face in her hands. Stupid, she thought. She was supposed to be the brains in their relationship, and she dropped the ball. How in the hell had she let Jerry convince her any of this was a good idea? They didn't even know where the nearest hospital was. Okay, I'm going now. I'll be right back, okay? She said. Jerry said nothing. Amy ran as fast as she could towards the smoke. Jumping briars and bushes, she crested a small ridge and came into sight of the cabin. She practically bowled over the door. Charlie, Lindsay, and Shelly all jumped up from where they were sitting. What took you guys? Lindsay asked. Amy had to catch her breath so she wouldn't stumble over her words. Charlie walked over to her, obviously more than a little drunk. "Where is Jerry?" he asked. Amy was trying to keep it together. "He's in the woods and he needs help." She finally got out the last part, coming out as a sob. That seemed to sober Charlie up a little. "Take me to him," he said. 4. Once his nausea subsided, Jerry was on cloud 9. He could feel everything. The trees were dancing, and the colors were singing. This shit was better than anything his boring textbook had even hinted at. Man. He wished Amy was here now that he felt better. She'd love this shit. His body still felt numb and weak, but if he could get up and go find her, then she wouldn't be so worried. Plus, once she tried some of this stuff, she wouldn't be worrying about anything. Thinking about how great it would be once they were both tripping, caused him to almost fall over laughing. Damn, he thought, he needed to get a hold of himself and go find her. He ran his hand through his long shaggy hair, which was now drenched with sweat. The buildup had been rough, but when this stuff hit, it really hit. His stomach was still pretty rough as well, but shrooms did the same thing to him. At least he didn't have to worry about getting the munchies. So maybe everything would be okay. The cramps and pangs would subside, and he would be back to feeling right as rain. He was tempted to take a little more just to help even him out, but then there wouldn't be enough for Amy and the others. He pushed himself up into a sitting position and tried to stand. When he did, there was a sick sound, like someone breaking a stick, but louder and crunchier. Dull throbs in his legs were his only sign that something had broken inside him. With dim realization, Jerry realized that the sound had come from him. "What the hell?" he muttered, trying to push himself back up, only to fall back down as his hand spasmed. He watched in drugged horror as the fingers on his right hand broke and spread, the webbing between them ripping and tearing. Blood pouring down his hands as the tendons and muscles ripped and reformed. The pain should have been worse, he realized, but it seemed the Wolfsbane was dulling his senses. He barely felt it. The fingers grew and curved. His other hand fell out from behind him. Jerry fell face down to the forest floor, his mouth filling with pine tags and dirt. He prayed that this was just a hallucination. But he'd never actually felt pain from a hallucination before. And then there was the moon. Why was the moon so fucking important suddenly? He didn't have time to think about that, as his legs started flailing, and with his bleeding and elongated clawed hand, he ripped off his shirt and jacket. He was too hot. Everything was too hot. If he could just get cool, maybe everything would be better. His left hand continued breaking and setting itself. Shit, he should have listened to Amy. Please just stop, Jerry tried to say, but found that his mouth wouldn't work right. That was when he really thought maybe he wasn't hallucinating after all. He tried moving his mouth from side to side, but it wouldn't go. And he started to choke and gag as something fell into his throat. Jerry retched and puked dark red blood, and then kept spitting out little hard things. Teeth, he realized in horror that those were teeth. His teeth. Another pain racked his body as his back broke and reformed, and new teeth took the place of the old, shooting through his gums and cutting Jerry's tongue, filling his mouth with blood, which pooled freely out of his mouth. At some point he must have blacked out. Because when he came to, he was face down, breathing in the rich scent of the dirt from the forest floor. Everything was sore. He felt like he had just went 3 rounds with Mike Tyson. He could smell the pile of blood and puke all around him. It caused another sharp pang in his stomach, but he was shocked to find that this one was hunger. What the fuck is wrong with me? He thought in disgust. His thoughts were getting hazier and hazier though, like they did whenever he was about to black out. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself somewhere in the forest. He was by a bunch of bushes. He couldn't see the cabin anymore. But he didn't even care. He kept trying to think about Amy, but it was too hard. The only thing he cared about was how hungry he was. He sniffed the air. It was amazing how much he could smell, the dirt, the trees, even the smoke in the air. They must have gotten a fire going at the cabin. His stomach rumbled, and it ended in a throaty growl. So hungry. He needed to take care of that, Jerry thought. Taking a deep breath, shocked to find that he could count the animals in the trees by smell. But there was something else, something that smelled better than everything else. He drooled just thinking about it. He looked up at the moon. It was important to him now. But he didn't know why. Right now he didn't care. His ears alerted him to the sound of something walking through the woods. Whatever it was getting closer to him, but Jerry wasn't too worried. After all, they brought that good food smell with them. 5. Wait a minute, what are you doing? We are coming with you. Lindsay shouted, standing in front of the door defiantly. Charlie groaned. Look, you're not going to be any help if Jerry's sick. The last thing he needs is your commentary while I carry him back, he said smugly. Lindsay sat on the couch and sulked. Shelly, you stay here too, he told her in a less snappish tone. Yeah, no problem, she answered. It wasn't like she wanted to go back out there anyway, but staying in here with Lindsay could prove to be worse based on the other girl's mood. As soon as she sat down in the chair, Lindsay sprang up and went into the bedroom, slamming the door. So much for that talk she'd been waiting on. Charlie grabbed Amy's arm, leading her out the door. She will get over it, he mumbled to no one in particular, thinking that all of this was just because he told her to stay in here. Amy was crying while she walked, doing her best to lead them both back to Jerry. She wished she had stayed with him. What was she thinking, letting him talk her into coming out here to try a drug he read about in some textbook from his folklore studies class? She should have known better. After all, Jerry was always up to stuff like this, and it was her job to be the voice of reason. But this time she had failed, and Jerry might be seriously messed up because of it. That train of thought brought another round of sobbing as she tried to hold the flashlight steady in the dark. Amy, look, I'm sure he's fine. All he probably needs to do is to sleep it off, Charlie said, doing his best to sound reassuring. Though in truth, he was just as worried as she was. After 2 years of college with Jerry, Charlie had always kind of expected this situation to happen. He just always prayed that he wouldn't be the one with his friend when it did. Amy looked up at him and folded her arms. I don't know. I've never seen him look this bad before. She sniffled. The last part came out as a sob. What if he's out there overdosing, for God's sake? I just left him out there, she sobbed, gesturing wildly at the dark forest around them. Once she started, she could not stop. The tears flooded her face anew. Charlie put his arm around her. If he is sick, we can take him into town. It's only like 15 minutes away, he told her, really hoping that's all it was. She nodded and pulled away from him. He was right. Her having a breakdown right now would just make everything worse. She took a couple more steps and moved the flashlight around until she found what she was looking for. There on the ground was one of Jerry's shoes. But where was Jerry? She wondered. Amy stopped. He was right here, she whispered, not knowing what else to say. Shit, Charlie muttered. He probably got up and wandered off. Damn it, Jerry, he muttered. The last thing he wanted to do was to walk around all night trying to find his friend, who was probably fried out of his mind. If it wasn't so cold out, Charlie would have marched straight back to the cabin and left him out here for the night. But high or not, he didn't want Jerry to wind up sick or worse. After all, he didn't really know how cold it got up here in the mountains at night. It was only a little after 8 now, and he was already freezing, and Jerry hadn't even been wearing a jacket. Amy stomped her foot. I'm telling you, he couldn't have. He was way too messed up. He couldn't even stand when I left back for the cabin. She looked around, kicking leaves and throwing branches. Defeated, Amy sunk down, hugging herself and rocking on her knees. I just left him here. I should have stayed with him. I love him, Charlie, and now if anything happens to him, that's on me, she said, sobbing. Charlie sighed. He wasn't drunk enough for this. He went over to help her up. Look, Amy, I've known Jerry for a long time. This isn't the first time he has wandered around in the woods fucked up, and to be honest, I doubt it's going to be his last time either. he said, trying to lighten the mood. Amy brushed back her tears and tried to smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Yeah, I guess you're right. We'll find him and everything will be okay. Of course, let's just follow this trail up a little more and see if we see him. I'd be willing to bet anything he was just looking for a more comfortable spot to pass out in, he said as they walked farther along the path. Charlie took his own flashlight out of his pocket, the one he usually kept in the van, and clicked it on, illuminating the ever-increasing darkness of the forest, showing them way more than the flashlight app Amy had been using on her phone. Much better, Amy said, happy now that she wasn't stumbling along the path. There was a crunch of twigs snapping, and Charlie moved the flashlight over to one of the pine trees, looking for the source of the sound. Hey, Amy said at the sudden loss of the light. She stopped when she saw what had captured Charlie's attention. On one branch something was hanging. Looks like Jerry's shirt, Charlie said. The small branch cracked the rest of the way and fell to the ground, the shirt coming down with it. It was Jerry's shirt. They both looked at each other and shined the light back up the tree, both of them thinking the same thing. Who the hell had it gotten up there? They searched, but Jerry himself didn't seem to be in the tree. Nor was he hurt anywhere near the base of it, which was a relief to both of them. He kept saying how hot he was. He must have taken it off, she said. At least now they knew they were going the right way. Took it off? It looks like he tore it off, Charlie said, holding up the shredded garment. I hope he brought more clothes. Why would he tear it up like that? Amy asked him. To which Charlie could only shrug. Hey, that's not all he took off though, Charlie said. He moved the flashlight over to where Jerry's jeans lay on the ground, a little further from the tree. But something was wrong with them. Going off the path a little, there seemed to be a whole trail of Jerry's clothes. Whatever he took must have really made him sweat, thought Charlie, as Amy ran ahead of him dolefully following the trail of clothes. Charlie stopped and went to grab the jeans, but when his fingers touched them, he reeled back. They were wet, and had some sort of dark liquid on them all over them. Fuck, he muttered and quickly wiped the fingers on some leaves. That's what he got for trying to be nice. Jerry must have pissed or shit himself, or both. Not to mention the shirt smelled like vomit. No, hallucinogens were worth all that, if that's what Jerry wanted to trip out on, more power to him. But Charlie decided right then and there that the only thing he was doing this weekend was drinking beer and smoking a little grass. And second, that this Wolfsbane, whatever it's called, wasn't going in his van under any circumstances. The last thing he wanted was for anyone to get sick like this, inside of his baby. He knew from experience how hard it was to get the smell of vomit out of the shag carpet. Come on, Amy hollered a little way up from him, breaking his train of thought. Jerry's got to be at the end. At the end was one of his socks, but there was no Jerry in sight. Socks that were practically torn to shreds. Jesus, I hope Jerry brought more clothes. Charlie mused. The last thing he wanted was to babysit a naked Jerry all week. Amy had turned her phone light back on, and was looking back and forth. Shit, Charlie said, after looking around for a while and once again not finding hide nor hair of Jerry. I guess we should spread out and look for him in this area, Amy said. She and Charlie split up to canvass the area more thoroughly. Amy's phone kept vibrating, reminding her it was about to die, and once it did, she'd be alone in the dark. There were no other signs of Jerry. She could hear Charlie yelling his name in the distance. The sound was comforting. She wasn't completely alone, she reminded herself. It was eerie how silent the surrounding forest was. On campus there were always squirrels running around and birds. She had expected more sounds of wildlife in a forest, even after dark. Here, however, the only break from the silence was Charlie's yelling. Part of her wanted to head back over to where he was, regretting the decision to split up. Suddenly, she heard a sound much like footsteps and looked up. Pulling her jacket firmly around herself, she stepped forward. The sounds were coming from a mound of thick holly bushes. Something was moving around in them. Pine needles rustled under the thing's feet as though it was struggling with something, or having trouble standing. "Jerry?" she asked, hoping they'd finally found him. No answer. She crept closer. For the first time since coming here, she felt terrified. What would she do if it was a coyote or something worse? Don't be ridiculous, she thought. It's probably just Jerry passed out and tossing in his sleep. No sense freaking myself out over nothing, she thought. She now stood right beside the dense bushes, still unable to see what was making them move. She steeled herself and pulled them apart. "Sure?" she asked until she saw what was on the other side. Across the way, Charlie heard Amy's blood-curdling scream. 6. Lindsay came out of the bedroom. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Shelly had been close to nodding off on the couch. Her half-empty beer was on the floor by her feet. "Hear what?" she mumbled, finding her mouth parched and tasting of cheap beer. Between the heat from the crackling wood stove and cheap beer, she was honestly surprised that she hadn't fallen asleep sooner. The thought of the beer was almost enough to make her gag. She sat up, careful not to knock the drink over on the floor. Lindsay rolled her eyes at her. "You didn't hear a scream?" she asked again. "No, I heard nothing," Shelly said. She sank herself deeper into the faded old couch, wiggling herself around to get more comfortable. "Besides, I think if they got in trouble, they would call us instead of just screaming," she said, holding up her cell phone. Lindsay huffed. "Not if they were in a lot of trouble, you idiot," she said. "You don't have to get nasty," Shelly replied, already drifting off again. Suddenly, a loud and very distinct scream echoed somewhere outside the cabin and brought both of them to their feet. "Don't tell me you didn't hear that," Lindsay said. "Yes, I heard it." "Do you think it was an animal?" she asked, now completely awake. Lindsay's mouth dropped, and she just stared at Shelly incredulously. "An animal? You really think that was an animal?" "Yeah, I guess I don't know. I rarely find myself stuck in the middle of the forest in a creepy-ass cabin," Shelly said. She found she had to sit back down on the couch. She clutched her head. Standing up too fast had made all the blood rush from her head. An action that made the entire floor spin, and moving didn't help at all with the nausea she still felt from the alcohol. She felt like she might get sick, remembering just how many times she'd been told not to drink on an empty stomach. Both girls screamed as someone or something started banging on the front door. Lindsay produced a knife from the drawer in the makeshift kitchen. Long, thin, and curved just like the one her dad used to fillet fish. Now Shelly knew she was going to be sick. The banging became more rapid. Like whatever was outside was on the verge of trying to break it down. "Guys, it's me. Open the fucking door," Charlie shouted, and continued to bang on the door. After both girls took a sigh of relief, Lindsay ran to the door and quickly threw back the locks. Charlie was standing there, looking worse for wear. His sleek blonde hair was now wild and covered with leaves and twigs. He was covered from head to toe in mud and sweat. He jumped through the doorway and slammed the door shut, while the girls just stared at him. "Charlie, you're freaking me out. What the fuck is going on?" Lindsay said in a much calmer voice than Shelly thought she would have been able to manage. Charlie was trembling and in shock. They realized he was crying. "Shut the door," he all but howled. Holding his side and running past Lindsay, he slammed the door. The echoing boom as it closed, making them all jump. "Charlie, calm down, what's going on?" Shelly asked, wide-eyed, as Charlie seemed to completely ignore both of them, concentrating instead on sliding all the door's locks into place. Then he hefted the large block of wood into place. The movement made his shirt ride up high across his abs. "Jesus, what happened to your side?" Lindsay asked, walking over to him and with shaky hands pulled his shirt back up. He stood there still shaking, bracing himself against the door, as though hell itself was about to come through. But even standing there, Lindsay and Shelly could clearly see the large gash in his side. Shelly walked over and put a hand on Charlie's shoulder. He jumped. "Charlie, sit down and tell us what happened. It looks like something took a chunk out of your side," she said, not knowing how she was able to stay so calm. He dolefully followed her to the couch and sat down. Content: that nothing was going to break through the door in the next 5 seconds. "I think I saw a first aid kit in the bedroom," Lindsay said and ran to get it. Shelly placed a hand on his forehead. He was burning up and still sweating profusely. She didn't know what to do. He just kept rocking and shaking. His whole body seemed to be coiled with nervous energy. She thought about trying to slap him out of it, but was too afraid he would start crying again. And then, they wouldn't be able to find out what was going on. Lindsay came back with a small red bag with a white cross on it, and a blanket. Charlie took his shirt off, and let them wrap the blanket around him. While Lindsay sprayed his side with disinfectant and bandaged it, Shelly was trying to find him something to drink. Something besides beer, that is. She looked at the door. The last time she had seen the box of water bottles was out in the van. One look at Charlie told her that she didn't want to go out there right now. She grabbed him a cold beer and came back over. She tried pressing the beer to his forehead, hoping that the cold would help calm him. But as soon as she did, he reached up and grabbed it, popped the top and chugged it down without stopping for a breath. Lindsay sighed. "Well, at least now we know that he's going to be okay." When it was empty, he crushed the can and held his hand out for another one. Shelly arched an eyebrow at him. Lindsay gave her a pleading look, so she went and grabbed another. Holding it a short distance away this time. "First, tell us what happened." Charlie shook his head. "You guys won't believe me," he told them, his hand still outstretched. "And how do you know that?" Lindsay asked. "Because I don't believe me." He all but sobbed. Shelly handed him the beer. "Take it slow this time and just tell us. We promise to believe you." She did her best to sound comforting. After seeing Charlie, neither one of them could bring themselves to ask about Jerry and Amy. "Where's Amy and Jerry?" Lindsay asked, snapping her fingers right in his face to get his attention. He took another gulp of his almost empty beer. "Fine, I'll tell you, but then we all need to get the hell out of here." Shelly and Lindsay looked at each other. "Fine?" they both said in unison. "Okay," Charlie said. "This is what happened." 7. Charlie had been searching for Jerry when he heard Amy's scream. He had been about to give up and head over to her anyway. He figured it would teach Jerry one hell of a good lesson to sleep it off in the woods, cold or not. The woods had only gotten darker since they'd begun their search. Maybe the nagging fear he had about his flashlight beginning to die was coming true. The light seemed dimmer, that or all the beer he'd been drinking had finally kicked in. Definitely time to start heading back in. The last thing he wanted was to get lost out here. The others would never let him hear the end of it if he did. He figured Amy had probably just tripped or run into a spider web or some shit. But the last thing he was going to do was head back without her. Charlie tried calling out her name, but she didn't respond. He walked over to where he had last seen her, but she wasn't there. Shit, he thought, I really hope she didn't fall and hit her head on something. Though he was loath to admit it, maybe Lindsay was right, and partying out at his uncle's cabin wasn't exactly the best idea after all. That's the last thing that they would need, Jerry somewhere out here and Amy laid out in the woods with a concussion. That would guarantee his uncle would never let them come out here again. Not to mention that they would have to answer some questions with the local cops on why they were out here in the first place, and he was sure after their last encounter that wouldn't go over well. And who knows what they would do if they found out why they were actually out here in the first place. And that was mild compared to how ballistic his dad would go. As he stumbled through the dark looking for Amy, he could already see the conversation play through his head. "Well, you see, officer, me and my friends didn't go to the beach for spring break, so we could instead come here to take a bunch of hallucinogenic plants. Oh no, officer, it must be safe. After all, our friend Jerry, the stoner lost in the woods, got the idea from his folklore studies class, and stuff always worked out well in those stories, don't ya know?" he muttered as he walked. They would be spending the rest of the break in a tiny, cramped cell. Plus, when they found Jerry's pot, that's when the charges would really start being handed out to everyone. Nothing like some misdemeanor possession charges, to really help kick off their junior year of college. Maybe if they were lucky, the incident wouldn't get reported back to the university. He laughed. It wasn't exactly like luck was on their side today. Charlie was sweating, and not just from exhaustion. His nerves were getting to him. Every crack of twigs underfoot made him feel like jumping out of his skin. When the wind blew, he swore something else was out here with them. He needed to stop thinking about all this. Where the hell were they? He wondered and then tried to calm himself. Amy's fine, Jerry's fine, they are just lost. Maybe Amy didn't fall. He tried to reassure himself in vain. That's it. Maybe she's just playing a prank on him. Or maybe when Jerry took some of that stuff, she did too. And now she's on the same trip that he's on. Yeah, he thought, maybe she just took some of the monkshood too, and now she's naked and passed out in the woods, but alive. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. That's all it was. They were just high as a kite. He quickly pushed the ideas of bears and worse out of his head, and kept walking. Yeah, no harm, no foul. If both of them were out here like that, they would be fine. Just find them, bring them to the cabin, and let the whole thing blow over. In the morning it would all just be one big joke, and they'd laugh about it for the next few years. One of those things they bring up in the bar after an awkward silence. A funny anecdote of their wild college years. Charlie's foot hit something wet and slick, his foot flew out from under him and he went down hard on his back. Oof! He groaned as the wind was knocked out of him, as he flopped to the ground, causing the beer to slosh around his stomach. He sat there dazed for a minute, then let out a loud burp. Happy that was all that came out. Sitting up, he reached forward, his hand met something dark and sticky. Whatever it was everywhere, and it didn't feel like mud. He was just thankful it didn't smell like shit. That would have been his luck tonight. His grasping hand finally found the flashlight. It had turned off when he fell. Flicking it back on, he shined it over to where his left leg was to see what exactly he had slipped in. That's when Charlie screamed. The light shone onto what was left of Amy. Poor Amy had been torn to shreds. Pieces of her were littered around the area, as if some animal had just dug in and pulled her apart. Her eyes looked into Charlie's with a glassed-over pled to save her, while her mouth would forever be locked in a last scream. Something warm made its way down Charlie's leg, but he didn't care. He scooted backward like a dog with its tail between its legs, and threw up the contents of his stomach, all stomach acid and half-digested booze. Tears streamed down his face, in part from getting sick, but mostly out of sheer fear. Something nearby rustled, like something massive moving through the bushes. Charlie had gone hunting with his father and uncle enough times to recognize the unmistakable sound of a large animal making its way through the forest. Bear, he thought as he got to his feet. Of course, a big feral starving bear. Oh man, oh man. He took one last look at Amy and forced his legs to move. Once he started running, he found it hard to stop. His legs pumping faster and faster as he made his way to the cabin. The earlier buzz from the booze was long gone, only to be replaced by sheer adrenaline. But with every step he took, he swore that another louder one sounded behind him. At first, he thought it was the pounding in his ears, but he swore it sounded like it was coming behind him, and coming fast. 8. They pushed the couch in front of the door. A bear. That's what Charlie kept saying repeatedly. There was a bear out there, and it had probably killed Amy and maybe even Jerry. Lindsay just couldn't wrap her mind around it. How could a bear do that? Why would a bear do that? Charlie sat down on the floor and kept draining beer after beer, doing his best to drink himself into a coma. Moving the couch in front of the door had seemed like the right thing to do at the moment, but looking at it now, Shelly felt a little ridiculous. A bear wouldn't be able to break down the door anyway, not with that bar in place. At least, she was pretty sure that it couldn't. To be fair, this was her first bear attack. She felt like she should cry or scream for her dead friends, but at the same time, none of it actually felt real. If Charlie wasn't such a mess, she would have accused him of trying to pull a prank on them. But even he wouldn't drink himself into oblivion over a joke. Lindsay was pacing and chewing her nails. Did you actually see the bear? She asked, coming to an abrupt halt. Still, hoping that at any moment they would be a knock on the door, followed by Jerry and Amy's giggling. Charlie mumbled something as he walked to the back bedroom to change his clothes. They had helped him to get his hands and face clean of Amy's gore. If that's what it was. Lindsay reminded herself, still refusing to believe. What did you say? He asked her, incredulous. Shelly could only look at Lindsay in admiration, watching at how easily Lindsay could morph back into full bitch mode. She seemed to draw herself up like a cobra, ready to strike. I said, did you see the bear? Do I need to say it any slower? Lindsay asked Charlie. Charlie turned around, wild-eyed. No, I didn't see the bear, Lindsay. If I had seen the bear, I would be dead too. Instead of sticking around and playing Ranger Smith, I hauled ass before Yogi came back for seconds. The last part came out as a choked-off sob, killing the forceful delivery he had been trying to make and making it clear to them he was telling the truth. Shelly blinked back her tears, finally comprehending what Lindsay had been trying to get at. Shelly stood up. Then how do you know it was a bear, if you didn't see it? How do we know there isn't some maniac out there with an axe right now? She asked Charlie. Lindsay nodded at her. Exactly. If we don't know it was a bear, then we should try to call out now. Just because that door will keep out a bear, doesn't mean it will keep out a person. Not to mention the windows. I mean, we gotta think of something before it's too late. Charlie kept rubbing his now spotless hands. Shit, it is already too late. I've been trying to get a signal for like an hour now. Shelly confided in them. They all shared a troubled look with each other. That's when the howling began, a low and distant rumble that seemed to shake the windows and the panes. For a minute it seemed like it was all around them, engulfing them, but in an instant it was gone. Whatever it was sounded like it was right outside the cabin. What the fuck was that? Shelly asked no one in particular. Something large slammed itself into the front door. Shelly and Lindsay ran towards the noise and threw their weight against the couch, doing their best to bolster the door. It groaned and cracked, the dark wooden slab shuddering with each mighty blow. It sounded as if it was ready to give at any moment, but amazingly it held. Charlie cradled himself in a corner. His legs had turned to jelly, something warm was trickling down his leg. Again. My hero, Lindsay muttered as she pushed back against the couch. Shelly was struggling, shoving the rickety frame of the old couch as hard as she could. As suddenly as it came, the force battering on the other side of the door stopped. What the hell was that? Shelly asked as both girls sagged against the couch. I don't know, but it definitely wasn't a bear, Lindsay replied. Charlie, get up and make yourself useful. Block off that window over there. Lucky for them, the cabin only had one window, and that was in the living room. It only had 2 rooms really, a bedroom with a shower area and a living room/kitchen. Charlie's uncle had only seen it necessary to put in a single window. Perhaps just to prove he wasn't cheap. There were tools under the sink, and by breaking apart a small bookshelf littered with girly magazines, they could board it up at least to a degree that they felt safe. Safe as they could feel in their current situation. Lindsay and Shelly stayed near the couch, just in case whatever was out there came back and take another swing at the door. Using a couple of leftover boards, they could reinforce it somewhat. The bite on Charlie's side burned. He jumped and screamed, tearing at his clothes. He felt as though something was burning through his very veins. The girls jumped back from the door and stared at him. Even the creature on the other side seemed to stop and listen. He stopped and stared at them, and then Charlie hit the ground with a loud thud. He was out like a light. Well, that was anticlimactic, Lindsay said. She got up to inspect him. Shelly moved to help. No, can you stay there just in case? Lindsay asked her, nodding towards the barricaded door. Yeah, no problem, Shelly said immediately, seeing the problem that her moving away from the couch would cause. Although the thought of her being the key force in keeping the creature out was downright laughable. But if it made Lindsay happy, then Shelly decided she'd do it. Lindsay grabbed hold of Charlie's arms and dragged him unceremoniously into the bedroom, where she left him crumpled and on his side, lying on the floor like a discarded towel. She sat back down beside Shelly and shook her head, sending her strawberry blonde hair fluttering every which way. "What an idiot," she muttered. Shelly looked over at her. "But he's our idiot," she replied, scooting closer to Lindsay, who for once during this trip didn't pull away from her. "Do you think he took whatever Jerry did?" Lindsay asked. "Doubt it. Charlie can barely tell the difference between trees and bushes," Shelly said, and they both laughed. "For now we should just get some sleep. The last thing we need is to be tired and paranoid." "You're right, we can sleep in shifts on top of the couch. When the sun comes up, hopefully that thing will be gone, and we can pile into the van and get the hell out of here," Lindsay replied. She looked over at Shelly and noticed how tired she looked. Hell, it was a big night for them, beer, a big group trip, and now her first murdered friend and cabin survival scenario. On that note, Lindsay decided this was going to be the last vacation she took until after graduation. "You sleep first and I will wake you up in a couple of hours," Lindsay said to her. Shelly smiled weakly and crawled up onto the couch. The steady inhale and exhale of her breathing threatened to send Lindsay to sleep as well. She couldn't hear anything from outside. She kept the hammer in one hand, just in case. Her thoughts drifted to Amy. Would it really have made any difference if she'd had a hammer or not? Amy was dead. She had always been Jerry's stoner girlfriend, but mostly she and Lindsay had gotten along. After all, Charlie had been her and Shelly's friend since freshman year. And Jerry was Charlie's best friend, so she'd always been around, but Lindsay felt like she'd never taken the time to get to know her. And now she would never have the chance to. 9. Charlie woke up in a dark room, and in a lot of pain. Not the small "I have a bruise" pain. Oh no. This was the real deal. It was that my everything was broken, and my teeth were rotting out at the same time. His body was on fire, every nerve ending seemed to be sending signals to his brain at one time. He tried to cry out, and instead choked out a huge splatter of what must have been blood, because it left a coppery taste in his mouth. He found he couldn't speak. It seemed his vocal cords were all twisted up in what felt like a rough knot in his throat. Trying to say anything at all just made him choke and cough more. The bite mark on his side felt more like a brand, and all he wanted to do was look at the fucking moon that he knew without a doubt was overhead right now. His fingers started cracking and breaking in on themselves. New agony flared through his mind, and fresh tears sprang to his eyes, burning as they trailed their way down the suddenly raw skin of his face. It hurt too much to think. He tried everything he could think of to make it stop, but his body seemed to be moving of its own violation. His back was snapping and breaking. Every vein on his neck stood rigid as his skin ripped and tore itself away from his muscles, degloving itself from his body like that of a snake. His fingers broke and grew longer, the nails on his hands thickening and curling, now resembling claws. His jaw, which he wanted to use to scream, elongated and snapped, unhinging itself violently like that of a cobra as his lower jaw also seemed to stretch itself out. He threw up on the floor. The smell of blood and bile consumed the tiny room. The transformation went on for another half hour. When it was done, a pile of shed skin, teeth, and other bodily fluids sat next to the newly transformed Charlie. When his eyes opened, the all-American baby blues that had once driven the girls around campus crazy were gone. They had been replaced with a set of hungry yellow eyes that were already looking left and right for their next meal. A meal that his nose told him was close by. Very close by. 10. The sounds of crashing from the back room startled Shelly awake. Lindsay was asleep beside her on the couch. She ran her hand through Lindsay's hair. Lindsay stirred in her sleep. Shelly stood and decided that she would check in on Charlie and let Lindsay sleep. It had to be close to sunrise now, anyway. She had probably tried to stay awake longer so Shelly could get more sleep. How thoughtful, Shelly thought with a small smile. She really wished all this was going on under different circumstances. Shelly paused outside of the bedroom, realizing that she wasn't exactly sure what she might walk in on. If Charlie was messed up, he could be in there messing himself or God knows what else. And party rules dictated that if she walked in on it, then she'd have to help clean it up. The thrashing seemed to get louder. She heard a scrambling sound, like the sound her cat made when it runs across her hardwood floor, but louder. As though it was from something much bigger. She put her ear to the door, and heard the unmistakable sound of an animal growling. Her hands trembled on the knob. She backed up into the wall opposite the door. Had the bear gotten inside? She wondered, trying in vain to remember if there was even a window in that room. Perhaps it wouldn't be such a bad idea to wake up Lindsay after all, she thought. She went over to Lindsay and admired her sleeping form. It would be such a shame to wake her up. After all the events of last night, she was finally sleeping peacefully. With a sigh, she shook her awake. A thud echoed from the bedroom door. Whatever was in there wanted out. What? Lindsay mumbled, trying to roll over and go back to sleep. Shelly shook her again. Lindsay, there is something in the room with Charlie, Shelly said, trying to keep the panic out of her voice as whatever was in there rammed the door again. Lindsay's eyes opened a little. What? She asked again, a little less groggily. Shelly repeated herself. Lindsay was now fully awake. She stretched her low-cut t-shirt, pulling high and exposing her well-toned midriff. Those gym sessions were really paying off. Shelly struggled to get her mind back to the matter at hand. She realized Lindsay had asked her a question. What did you say? She asked. Lindsay looked at her, her face showing confusion. I said Charlie must be having a bad trip and is probably crawling around the floor. There's no way an animal could get in there. There aren't any windows in the back room, and as you can see, the one in here and the front door are both sealed up tight. I don't know, but something is moving around in there on all fours, and it sure as hell doesn't sound like Charlie to me, Shelly replied. Groaning, Lindsay got up and headed to the room in the back, with Shelly following close behind. The thrashing on the other side seemed to stop. Whatever was inside seemed to listen to them, waiting to see what they were going to do next. Lindsay looked at Shelly, who was practically shaking. Charlie, stop messing around in there. It's almost morning. Lindsay hollered, slapping her palm on the door. The entire cabin became eerily silent. The only sound was that of Lindsay's and Shelly's breathing. Without warning, something heavy battered itself into the door with a lot more aggression than it had before they'd been standing there. Lindsay jumped back. Shelly pulled her away with a wild, panicked look in her eye. On the other side, something was growling and snarling. With the third hit, the door gave, and a creature tumbled into the hallway and was followed by a terrible smell. As though whatever the creature was, it had wallowed in a pile of its own shit. Even worse was the musk. A strong smell of raw animal musk followed the beast throughout and seemed to fill up the entire shack. Lindsay and Shelly back-pedaled into the living room. Lindsay got a hold of her hammer. Shelly was mumbling in terror. In her hands, she held one of the leftover 2x4s. The creature approached them. Even as disfigured as he was, they could still make out some of Charlie's features. His skin was raw and pinkish, dotted with a thin coat of dewy hair that was growing longer while they watched. Charlie's jaw was now more canine, and his clawed hands and toes clacked on the floor as he moved on all fours towards them. Drooling and growling, he came closer. Charlie, what happened to you? Lindsay asked as she brandished her hammer. He gave her no answer. Charlie ran, then, coming to a sudden halt, he arched back and pounced, leaping through the air at Shelly, snapping his jaws. She swung her 2x4, and it broke across Charlie's shoulder. If it hurt him at all, he didn't show it. Lindsay stood frozen as Charlie clawed at Shelly. She was struggling under him, kicking, punching, slapping, doing anything that might delay his snapping jaws from contacting her soft skin. His hot drool dripped down on her hungrily, making it clear to both the girls that whatever this thing was, it wasn't Charlie. It might have his body, but it wasn't him. Not really. Charlie fell forward and tumbled off of Shelly. Lindsay, having come back to her senses, had rushed forward and hit him on the head with her hammer. As he lay on the ground, she hit him again. And again. She hit him until blood ran from his deformed ears and mouth. Shelly stopped her, wrapping her arms tight around Lindsay, and pulled her back. "Stop. Stop," she cried. And the next thing Lindsay knew, she was crying and holding onto Shelly just as tightly. They clung to each other, each one pulling strength from the other. Shelly pulled away first. "We need to tie him up, just in case," she said. Lindsay pulled her eyes away from Charlie's prone form to turn to Shelly in shock. "What do you mean, just in case? Look at him, oh my God, I think I killed him," she said fervently, trying to wipe away the tears as they started. Shelly looked away so the other girl could collect herself. "We don't know that. None of this even makes sense. He doesn't even look like Charlie anymore, he's some type of monster. For all we know, he could be fine, heal up and be right back after us. We can't take any chances right now. We don't know what happened to him, or what he's become," she said. Without giving Lindsay time to reply, she went to the bedroom and pulled the cord out of the lamp in the corner, doing her best to avoid the piles of skin and mess. The smell made her gag and brought tears to her eyes. It was so strong. While Lindsay looked on bleary-eyed, she used the cord to tie Charlie's hands to his right ankle. Shelly was satisfied that even if it didn't hold him, the bindings would give them enough time to get away. "Well, someone's got a little kink in them," Lindsay said with a chuckle that sounded more like a light-hearted sob. Shelly took it as a good sign that she would be okay. Lindsay made a trip back to the bedroom and came out with the comforter, which she spread over the top of Charlie. Shelly arched an eyebrow at her. Lindsay fidgeted for a moment before saying, "That way we don't have to look at him." Shelly nodded. It made sense. She realized that somehow she had become numb to the whole situation. The blanket never stirred. "What if I killed him?" Lindsay asked her, her voice barely above a whisper. Shelly didn't know what to say. She did not know how they were going to explain any of this. All she knew was that without a doubt, she wanted to survive. "We need to go," Shelly finally said. Lindsay was still staring at the blanket and the form underneath. "What if it's still out there?" Lindsay asked. "There's only one way to find out, but if we stay in here, we won't be able to get help," Shelly replied. "Also, whatever you do, don't get bitten." Lindsay turned and looked at her, wiping away the tears in her eyes. "Why? Did you see Charlie's side?" Even transformed into whatever that was, the area around the bite was red and puffy, with signs of infection of some sort spreading out from it. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I think what Charlie turned into is linked to what bit him," Shelly replied. "You mean the bear?" Lindsay asked. "It wasn't a fucking bear," Shelly told her, shaking her head. "Look at him. Whatever did this was probably something like him. So we get bit, we turn into a murderous, hairy monster?" Lindsay asked incredulously. "I think we can safely assume that." "But that's impossible," Lindsay protested. "So, is everything else that happened tonight?" Shelly shot back, with more heat in her voice than she'd intended. There wasn't anything left to say after that, so they slid the couch away from the door. The loud dragging sound echoed throughout the cabin and grated on their nerves. Shelly's hand shook on the doorknob. Her and Lindsay's eyes met, sharing a moment of uncertainty before she pulled open the door. There was nothing on the other side except the soft glow of the morning sky before sunrise. The forest surrounding the cabin was completely silent. Almost serene, at least it would have been if she hadn't just watched her best friend Brain, one of their other friends, with a hammer after he'd turned into a monster. For a minute, Shelly wondered if they made a Hallmark card for that. The thought made her want to laugh, but she was too afraid it would come out as a sob. They stepped out of the cabin and shook, as the stark morning chill hit them full force. The van was only a couple of feet away. Each step seemed to send echoes out all around them. It felt as if they had walked miles when they finally reached the van. Wasting no time, they jumped in. Lindsay took the spare keys out of the glove compartment and went to turn the engine. Nothing happened. The dash lit up from the battery, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The headlights came on as Lindsay fumbled with knobs, a signal for anything waiting in the dim light of dawn that they were out of the house. "Turn off the lights," Shelly yelled. Lindsay looked frantic. "Don't yell at me. I can't help it that this stupid piece of shit doesn't work right." Fumbling, she managed to get the lights off. She repeatedly tried to crank the key, each turn only producing a faint whining noise. "Try pumping the gas," Shelly said. Lindsay shot her a dirty look but tried it anyway. After a few tries, the engine finally turned over, roaring loudly to life. Lindsay laughed. Fucking Charlie and his old-ass van. After disengaging the parking brake, they started heading up the driveway. "What is that?" Lindsay asked, looking into the driver's side mirror. "What is what?" was all Shelly had time to ask before something large slammed into the side of the van. Both girls screamed. "Drive faster," Shelly shouted. Lindsay smashed the pedal to the floor. The back wheels spun, sending up dirt and gravel as it flew up the narrow driveway. She turned the high beams on, to avoid any other unknown creatures. They rode in silence to the town, both too shaken to even speculate about what had happened. The sun came up as they hit the small town, both of them forgetting to pay enough attention as they entered to find out the name of the place. Not that it really mattered right now anyway. Shelly felt like it was probably something peaceful or biblical, like small towns. Charlie had been right though. All they had to do was take a left and drive straight. There wasn't much here, at least not much they could see. A gas station, a grocery store, post office, and a sheriff's station. Somewhere there was apt to be a courthouse, but they couldn't see it, at least not off the Main Street road. "Where's the hospital?" Shelly asked. "I don't see one," Lindsay said. Her face still streaked with tears while looking over at Shelly. She realized the other girl was much the same. They would both likely be questioned wherever they went at this point. "Should we go to the sheriff's office?" Shelly asked her. "I don't think we have another choice," Lindsay said, bringing the van to a stop beside the sheriff's cruiser that had pulled them over the day before. Before their nightmare had begun. 11. Lindsay put her hand on the door latch and then took it off. What were they going to say? That their friends turned into monsters. Oh, and don't forget, one of them is supposedly dead in the woods. And officer, heads up, I think I murdered our friend Charlie with a hammer in self-defense. Also, we tied up his corpse. Hope that's cool. Lindsay swallowed nervously, her hand still unmoving on the latch to get out of the van, as she wondered whether or not this was capital punishment state. "We need to get our stories straight," Lindsay said, spinning back around to face Shelly, who was tiredly curled up in the passenger seat, looking forlornly out of the window. "Fine. We tell them the truth. Jerry and Amy are missing, possibly dead. And Charlie turned into something and attacked us. We need to leave the monster part out," Lindsay said. "But it's true." "But no one in their right mind is going to fucking believe that," Lindsay replied. Shelly seemed to deflate at that. Maybe that was a little harsh, Lindsay thought. After all, he had almost torn her apart. "Look, I'm sorry, but we need to get our story together," Lindsay said. They both sat in the van for a minute and mulled over their options. They would have to say an animal attack happened, but what would happen when the sheriff saw the animals in question? Would he just shoot Charlie? Or even worse, what if they only got more people hurt by bringing them out there? For a minute, they considered just saying they had gone on a beer run and hadn't heard from their friends. But that was a coward's way out, and they both knew that story would fall apart as time went on. In a town this small, they would have stood out too much not to be noticed. Coming to a decision, they both jumped out of the van and headed towards the door. Shelly gasped. Lindsay turned around to see what had grabbed her attention. On the side of the van, exactly where the creature had hit it, was a very large dent, followed by a long slash down the side. A large claw still protruded out of the side. It must have been ripped off when they sped up. "Talk about breaking a nail," Lindsay muttered. Then shrugged when she realized Shelly was looking at her slack-jawed. Lindsay shrugged. They walked in. The sheriff's station was small, tiny even. The dispatcher sat behind her desk, a neat and portly-looking elderly woman who was on the phone discussing a church luncheon. She held up a finger to them as they walked in, letting them know she would be with them in a moment and not to disturb her. The AC was cool and caused goosebumps to rise on Lindsay and Shelly's flesh. They sat close together on the chairs that made up the waiting area. The smell of freshly made coffee filled the entire office. The smell made Shelly's stomach rumble loudly. She drew her arms closer around herself. Looking over at Shelly, Lindsay felt bad for being so hard on her yesterday. Sometimes she could be a real bitch, but Shelly hadn't deserved to take the brunt of it. After all, it wasn't her fault that she still didn't know how to handle what had happened between them. She honestly didn't know if she ever would be able to. But even now, she had to fight the impulse to wrap her arms around her. Lindsay was considering it up. After all, what did she have to lose at this point? When the woman behind the desk spoke up. "Can I help you girls?" The lady behind the desk asked, giving them the most judgmental once-over that Lindsay had ever experienced. She stood up. "Yes, we need to see the sheriff, please," Lindsay said, using all the sweetness she could muster. The last thing she wanted at this point was a tongue lashing from some small-town busybody. Realizing how dumb she must have looked, trying to put on a pleasant face when they were covered in blood and gore and probably smelled like God knows what, Lindsay quiet trying and let her natural tired frown fall back into place. The woman stared at them for a moment before hitting a button on her phone. "Sheriff, there are 2 young girls out here to see you." Lindsay tried to remain pleasant, remembering their current surroundings. After all, they were more than old enough to buy alcohol, so the young girl thing was getting old. The woman kept looking at Lindsay and Shelly's clothes and giving them a double-edged small-town smile. The sheriff came out from a back office then. He was just how they remembered him from yesterday, mustache and all. He didn't swagger the way the cops around campus did though. Something about the way he walked reminded Shelly of her uncle who was in the Marines. The way he carried himself said he was a professional. She suddenly felt relieved that they had come here after all. "What can I help you girls with?" he asked as his secretary went back behind her desk and pretended to not be eavesdropping. Shelly looked away. Lindsay just shrugged. It looked like she would have to do all the talking. "Yes, we were camping and there was an animal attack and my friends are hurt. And some of them didn't come back. We had to leave our friend Charlie back at the cabin. But 2 of our friends went into the woods with him, and we haven't seen them since," Lindsay said, her voice cracking several times. It was as close to the truth as she could get. The sheriff looked at her hard. "You left him in the cabin? You didn't take him with you to get help, him being hurt and all?" he asked. It sounded harsh, even though she'd been expecting it. They had prepared for this question in the van. "He didn't want to, sir. It's his leg that's hurt. He couldn't go fast and was afraid he would slow us down and told us to go on without him," she replied. "I see. So there is an animal, and it was what? Waiting outside the door?" he asked, not hiding the disbelief in his voice. "It ran into it a couple of times. Our friend Charlie, he said when they were in the woods it looked like a bear. We waited almost until sunrise before even making a run for it," she said as Shelly remained seated, listening intently. The sheriff seemed to mull that over for a minute, his right hand rubbing his mustache. "Might be, although this time of year, if it's this far down from the mountains it must be sick, and sick bears have attacked people, but it makes little sense for it to wait for y'all to leave." He must have reached a decision because he went into the back and returned with a large lever-action rifle. When he caught the girls staring at it, he said, "I hunt bear every now and again when I can get the tags. This is a 45 to 70 gov. It will put down a bear, no doubt about that. It's hell on the shoulder though," he told them, rubbing one of his shoulders as though in memory of it. The elderly lady emerged again from behind her desk. "Sheriff, do you want me to put in a call to Game Warden Thompson?" she asked. "Yeah, thanks Shirley," he told her. Looking back at the girls, he said, It will take him a while to get down there, and I don't need him for a single bear. What's the address you all were staying at? He asked them. Lindsay and Shelly looked at each other in confusion, both girls realizing that neither one of them knew the address. The sheriff must have caught on. Look, he said, why don't I just follow you back down the road? When we get there, you two can just stay in your van. I'll go in and get your friend out. He turned at the door. If I don't see it in the immediate area, we will get a group of hunters to search the woods for your friends and the bear. How long were you all in town for? He asked. Spring break, so the entire week and some of the next, Shelly said. The sheriff huffed. Hell of a way to spend it. With that, they all exited the office and made their way back down the road. Shelly looked like she was going to be sick, and Lindsay found she felt the same way. 12. The drive back seemed to only take a fraction of the time that their escape had. The sheriff drove like a maniac. He rode Lindsay's bumper the whole way there. Shelly sat upright as they turned onto the driveway that led back to the cabin. Neither one of them had really wanted to return. Lindsay could already see the thin sheet of sweat formed on Shelly's face as they went further up the driveway. She even felt it begin on her own forehead. After what seemed like an eternity, they once again found themselves in front of the cabin. Everything looked the same. The door was still shut. She couldn't believe how peaceful everything looked. A sharp knock on the driver's side window caused both girls to jump. It was just the sheriff. He motioned for Lindsay to roll down the window. I'm going to go have a look around. I want you girls to sit tight, okay? Without waiting for a reply, he shouldered his rifle, turned on a headlamp he had brought with him. He told them it was used for hunting and would help him find blood trails. And then he walked along the perimeter of the cabin. They watched as he strolled around the building, his headlamp swinging back and forth. What do you think he's looking for? Shelly asked her. Lindsay felt a smart-ass answer on her tongue and had to choke it back, realizing the other girl was probably just as tired and as scared as she was. Lindsay honestly didn't know how either of them had kept it together this long. I guess he's looking for tracks, she replied. Should we tell him it's not exactly a bear? Shelly asked. Lindsay shook her head. It wouldn't do any good. He wouldn't believe us, and either way, whatever hit the side of the van looked enough like a bear. If we're lucky, it's long gone, she replied, leaning back into the large captain's chair of the van. It felt like the weight of the world was sitting on her shoulders. She just wanted to be back in her dorm room, where everything was safe and familiar. They sat in silence, watching as the sheriff made his way to the front of the cabin. Keeping his rifle at the ready, he opened the door with one hand and went in slowly. At the sight of him entering the cabin, Lindsay moved her hand to the ignition, waiting for even the slightest sign that something had gone wrong so she could start it up and hit the road. Deciding right then and there that they had done enough heroics for one day. It felt like forever as they waited for the sheriff to come back outside. They watched with rapt attention for any movement in the doorway. Shelly nervously chewed her bottom lip. The sheriff reappeared for a moment, putting his head out the cabin door to vomit. Both girls watched the spectacle, too afraid to get out of the van and see what had caused it. A loud bang that lit up the windows followed his departure back inside the cabin. The unmistakable burst of a muzzle flash illuminated the doorway. Shelly's mouth dropped as Lindsay and she came to the same conclusion. Charlie? The sheriff had just killed Charlie, or had at least made sure he was dead. Lindsay felt tears streaking down her face as she realized with all certainty the sheriff had just ended any hope of them saving him. If there was any hope to begin with. How would they have saved him, anyway? They didn't even know how he had become, whatever it was he had become. Maybe that was the only cure for him, she thought to herself, not wanting to voice it out loud. At least now he wouldn't be that thing. She felt Shelly's arms go around her, and together they silently mourned their friend. Though Lindsay still didn't remove her hands from the wheel or the ignition. If shit got bad, they were getting out of here and not looking back. No matter what. Lindsay thought, blinking back unshed tears. The sheriff returned, holding the rifle downwards. He signaled for them to get out. Shelly shook her head, but Lindsay figured they might as well see what he wants. To her it was like a bad dream, one that she knew neither of them would ever wake up from. They exited the van and made their way to the sheriff. Shelby walked with a nervous gait that reminded Lindsay of a foal, ready to run. The sheriff's face was drained of color as he walked back out. To Lindsay, it looked like he was trying hard not to show how scared he was. She knew the feeling. He took a couple of deep breaths, just staring at the girls before he asked, "So whose bright idea was it to come out here and do Wolfsbane?" he asked, looking between both of them. "I don't know what you mean, Sheriff," Lindsay asked cautiously. Beside her, Shelly had turned white as a sheet. The guilt was written across her face. The sheriff looked around. "Cut the shit. I saw your friend in there. Nice job bashing his brains out, by the way, but heads up, if we all make it through this, next time remove the head." "What?" Shelly asked, sounding like she was going to be sick. "Or at least blow their brains out next time. Those things regenerate like a son of a bitch," he told them. "What? You think you're the only bunch that's ever come up here looking for this shit? At least, y'all had the good sense to go get some help. You should have seen this group of hippies that came up last summer. Now that was nasty." Lindsay felt like her brain was about to explode. "Wait. Slow down. You know what this is?" The sheriff chuckled dryly. "Course I do. What we have here is good old-fashioned lycanthropy. You see, the Wolfsbane in these hills is special. It comes from the old country. Specifically, the Black Forest. Take it during the full moon and you turn fanged and furry." "What about bites?" Shelly asked, remembering Charlie's wounds. "Yep, those can do it too," the sheriff told them. "Y'all have some shit luck. If you'd done it anywhere else, you just hallucinated until you passed out and woken up with a terrible case of cottonmouth. But the stuff that grows out here has a different kind of kick. Now tell me, was that the friend that took it?" They shook their heads. "Shit," he mumbled, then raised the gun up a little. "Now, being that I'm a gentleman and don't want to be forced to strip search you, please tell me right now if either of you two were bit by the animal?" Again, both girls shook their heads, albeit a bit more furious this time. Despite his cordial manner, it didn't take a genius to figure out what would happen if they gave the wrong answer. "Good," he told them. "The last thing I want to do is have to shoot you, or worse, turn you over to the local pack." "Pack?" Lindsay asked him. He shook his head. "Don't worry about it. No one's going to believe you, anyway. The best thing you two can do right now is to get back in the van and pretend like this was just a bear attack." Nodding, they started walking towards the van. Stopping, they looked over at the cabin. Both of them were curious, but at the same time, they knew what they would find on the other side. Lindsay's hand seemed to move of its own accord and pushed the half-opened cabin door back so she could see inside. Her feet moved like they were trudging through water, carefully. As she moved, she could feel Shelby following her close behind. The thought that she wasn't alone was comforting. Charlie was indeed dead. His body was still twisted and still more animal than man, but if you looked hard enough, you could still see him in there. It was truly terrible to behold. Shelby's hand slipped into hers and gave her a squeeze. One that Lindsay returned. The sheriff had been quick and precise, his large-bore rifle taking out a good portion of Charlie's head. One rabid yellow eye could still be made out. The other was splattered all over the floor and wall, along with a lot of red gore and softer, grayer bits of tissue that neither of them wanted to think about. Lindsay felt like she was going to be sick. She found herself back outside the cabin retching. Shelly's hands holding back her hair. Shelly made calming sounds as Lindsay got sick. "Get yourself together, girl," Lindsay thought to herself. She did her best to force herself to stop being sick. Eventually, her body agreed, but not until her stomach was completely empty. But she didn't seem to have the strength to stand back up. As she tried to push herself up, she again felt Shelly's hands wrap around her and help her upright. They could both hear the sheriff, as he spoke into his radio. Suddenly he stopped. "What the hell?" they heard him say. They heard it before they saw it, a large blurred shape that darted out of the forest. The sheriff never had a chance. Even in the dim light, they were able to watch as he went down in a shower of his own gore. The windows and hood of the squad car being sprayed in a thick cloud of arterial spray. The shape moved again, becoming more clear. If the creature had ever been Jerry, it now no longer resembled him. If Charlie had been mid-transformation, this must be what they looked like in their final form. All teeth and claws, like some sort of amalgamation of wolf and man. It was terrible to behold. A walking death machine. With one outstretched clawed hand, the beast raked the side of the van, puncturing one of its tires. Unless they could get to the sheriff's cruiser, they were as good as dead. As dead as the sheriff. Lindsay shuddered. The word lycanthrope echoed through her mind, becoming synonymous with death. 13. They ran towards the cruiser and the gun, both of them realizing that they wouldn't make it to the van in time. Lindsay pulled Shelly roughly behind her. The beast overshot its lunge and went down into a tumbled heap. A minor victory. It quickly recovered and tore after the girls. Lindsay realized with horror that it wouldn't matter if they made it to the cruiser or not, because that thing would rip them to shreds long before either of them could shoot it. It wouldn't even make for a good shelter. How long would it take the creature to bash through the windows? That wasn't a chance they could take. Without looking back, Lindsay sidestepped the cruiser and ran off into the woods. Shelly no longer needed to be pulled, and together they ran into the forest, which was cloaked in the dewy morning light. The creature howled and roared. The voice had no resemblance to whatsoever to Jerry's, or anything human for that matter. With every howl that echoed around them, the girls found more energy to run. Adrenaline coursed through their already tired bodies. If they survived this, Lindsay made a solemn vow that she would never skip leg day ever again. Shelly was running as fast as her legs could take her. She was straining, trying to hold on to Lindsay as she ran. She didn't need to look back to know it was after them. They could hear it, as the creature broke branches and trampled everything in its way as it came for them. The trees behind them echoed with the beast's hungry growls. "Come on, Shelly, hurry!" Lindsay shouted as she sprinted up ahead. She was pushing herself as hard as she could when suddenly, the entire forest was filled with a deafening howl. A howl that came not from behind them, but in front. A howl that stopped the girls and the beast chasing after them in their tracks. What the hell was that? Shelly all but screamed. The creature that used to be Jerry was on its knees with its head down, whimpering. "Whatever it is, it can't be good," Lindsay muttered under her breath. Both girls stared at each other with wide eyes and crept away from the creature. The beast that used to be Jerry sank low to the ground and exposed its throat out to the side. Lindsay had watched enough reruns of Planet Earth to know that was never a good sign in the wild. Oh God, what she wouldn't give to be high on her couch watching that right now instead of out here running for her life. Something big stalked out of the trees in front of them. Lindsay covered Shelly's mouth before she could scream, and together they backpedaled past the smaller of the two creatures and back towards the police cruiser and the way that they'd run. Because the beast that had just walked out of the trees was huge. It had long shaggy hair and only one eye. But where in Jerry's eyes there had been only hunger, in this creature's single eye there was nothing but malice. If Jerry was a beast, then this thing was a monster in every sense of the word, and Lindsay would not sit around and wait for whatever was going to happen next. Unlike Jerry, Lindsay and Shelly both knew just from watching it that this one could think. Behind the malice was a human-like intelligence. And they'd both seen enough movies to know that never ended well. Luckily for them, it seemed to be completely focused on Jerry or whatever was left of him now that he had turned into that creature. It growled low in its throat, causing Jerry to whimper and lay down on his stomach as the larger creature stood over him. It darted forward suddenly, and before Jerry or the girls could move, it had Jerry's throat clutched between its teeth. However, it didn't look like it was trying to kill him. Instead, it just held his throat between its teeth, as though to let him know who was in charge. Definitely not a good sign, Lindsay realized, and backpedaled as fast as she could. Once they were out of eyesight, they ran towards the cruiser, not daring to look back. They had become a little lost as they ran, and instead of finding themselves by the cruiser, they instead found themselves out in the middle of the driveway. They had to decide then whether to run back, and maybe make it to a vehicle and a gun, or run to the road and hope to flag down someone before lycanthropes ate them. But with how their luck was going, anyone who stopped for them was probably going to turn out to be a serial killer at this point. A bright light suddenly blinded both girls, followed by the unmistakable sound of a motor gunning towards them. Shelly tackled Lindsay out of the way. Knocking both of them off of the driveway and onto the forest floor, both girls huddled together, waiting for the certain death of the creature's claws and teeth. But they never came. The vehicle, however, had come to a complete stop, and the passenger window was now rolled down. "Are you girls going to get in, or are you going to lie there all night?" said the unmistakable voice of the sheriff's secretary. Lindsay pulled Shelly off of her, and then helped the other girl up. They both looked around for Jerry and the other creature, but they were nowhere to be seen. If the sheriff's secretary had seen anything, she gave no signs. Too tired to ask questions, Shelly and Lindsay climbed into the back seat of her SUV. "Y'all look like you've been through the ringer," she told them as they got settled in the back seat. "That's one way to put it," Lindsay replied as Shelly kept looking worriedly out of the SUV windows. Both of them waiting for one of the creatures to come charging in. The woman shook her head. "Y'all are lucky that I came out here when the sheriff didn't answer his radio," she told them. "But never y'all mind that now, Shirley's going to take good care of you." 14. Lindsay came awake with a start, sitting bolt upright. She found she was no longer in Shirley's back seat, but was instead on a soft, comfortable bed. Beside her, Shelly was still asleep. The only sign that she was even alive was her soft snores, which Lindsay found oddly comforting. What she didn't find comforting was the pounding in her head. Why did she feel hungover? She wondered, trying to grasp what she was feeling. "What the hell?" Lindsay muttered to herself. "How did they get here?" she wondered. Lindsay still couldn't figure out how a little old lady like Shirley would have been able to carry both girls out of the SUV in the first place. There was something off about this whole situation. Why hadn't Shirley taken them to a hospital? Or even back to the station? The lack of sound in the house put Lindsay immediately on edge. Not to mention the fact that she didn't actually remember falling asleep. There is something not right about this place, she thought. Her last memories had been up to getting in Shirley's car and drinking tea out of her thermos, and then nothing. Why don't I remember coming here? She wondered aloud. And with the sheriff dead, shouldn't they be surrounded by panicked policemen right now? Weren't people supposed to be questioned after something like that? That's what happened in all the TV shows she watched. She did her best to wake up Shelly, but the other girl was out. The best she could manage was to get her to groan and roll over on her other side. Well, at least I know she's alive, thought Lindsay. She tried to sit up, but the motion made the entire room spin, so she fell back on the bed. Her head was pounding just like the first morning of her freshman year of college, when she'd been convinced to do a keg stand. Something she swore she'd never do again. Did Shirley drive us? The thought scared Lindsay, but not as much as the next one. If she did drug us, then why? What reason would Shirley have to drug me and Shelly? After her head stopped spinning, Lindsay forced herself to stand. For her first attempt, all she managed to do was to slide off the end of the bed onto the floor, landing with a soft thump straight on her butt. Her body was a lot sorer than she had expected. Her legs felt like jelly. All that running and screaming yesterday had taken its toll. Drugged? She realized that the old bitch had drugged the tea. Why hadn't she figured it out sooner? They had been in such a hurry to get out of there, and away from the beasts, that they hadn't even stopped to question what an old lady would be doing driving around a crime scene. Whatever Shirley had given them was some powerful shit. Strong enough that Jerry would have been jealous. If he was even still alive. At least being on the floor gave her a chance to take stock of the room. There was light coming through the windows on the other side of the bed. It wasn't bright, so probably late afternoon. Lindsay figured, but more than enough light that she could see around the room. More than enough light for her to make out the bars on the other side of the window. Which made two things very clear. One, they wouldn't be using the window to escape, and two, whatever was going on here probably wasn't good. Lindsay let out a shudder as she looked closely at the bars on the window. They were old and in some places covered in rust. Which to her meant that Shirley had done this before. Maybe lots of times. But why? Lindsay wondered, and more importantly, what the fuck is wrong with this place? Lycanthropes and old lady kidnappers. This town should be required to put that shit on a sign. Or at least put an enter at your own risk sign up near the town limits. Taking stock of the rest of the room, she realized they were definitely in a guest room. There was only a bed and a dresser in here with them. The entire room was completely devoid of personal touches, no pictures or paintings. Or even religious icons for that matter. The blankets on the bed seemed to be a thick handmade quilt. A farm maybe? Lindsay figured keeping her mind occupied made her feel more in control, which was comforting. Looking back out the window, she noted the open fields, which seemed to support that. Though the view was very limited. There wasn't even a closet in the room with them. Lindsay had a sick feeling that the room was designed just for keeping people in it. Walking back across the room, she tried the only door. It had 2 deadbolts on it. And of course, it was locked. She had expected as much. After all, you don't kidnap people and then leave the doors unlocked. Not knowing what else to do, Lindsay climbed back onto the bed and snuggled closer to Shelly. She was tired, and it didn't look like they were going to get out of here anytime soon. And after a while, she fell into a light, fitful sleep. 15. The sound of the door opening startled Lindsay awake. It was dawn, that much she was sure of. Shelly groaned and slowly sat up, looking around in confusion, until she saw Lindsay. She could only shrug. She didn't have any answers either. "Why do I feel like shit?" she asked Lindsay. She was about to respond, when she noticed Shirley standing in the doorway holding a tray that was piled high with pancakes, eggs, and bacon. Plus, 2 glasses of orange juice. Lindsay reached out tentatively and grabbed the tray from Shirley's hands as she handed it to them. She smiled at them, a fake matronly smile. "Now y'all little things aren't going to give me any trouble, are you?" she asked them. Lindsay and Shelly both looked at the food. It smelled delicious, but she knew that like everything else around here, looks could be very deceiving. The last thing she wanted to do was wake up somewhere else. "No," Lindsay told her through gritted teeth. "No what?" Shirley asked sternly, placing a hand on her hip. "No ma'am," they both replied. Shirley looked at both girls and smiled warmly. "Now I know y'all got a bunch of questions, but you're going to have to bear with me. You see, we all have a whole lot to talk about before I can let you out of this room. So y'all eat up, and I'll come back in a little while and we'll sort all this out. Okay?" Shirley turned and walked out. Apparently, it was a rhetorical question. "So what did I miss while I was out?" Shelly asked after a minute of them both eyeing the food. Their stomachs rumbling, betraying them. "Well, Miss Mayberry over there drugged us and has us holed up in her guest room. On what I'm guessing is some country-ass farm, like the 2 final girls in a bad American Gothic movie." Lindsay said, exasperated. "I think that about sums it up." "Shit," Shelly said, sliding back down under the covers. "My thoughts exactly. Sorry, I didn't mean to lose my cool. It's just this is a whole new level of fucked up," Lindsay said, trying to keep her voice from rising. Shelly sighed. "It's fine, really. I mean, I think I'd be more worried if you were calm right now." "Yeah, me too," Lindsay said and gave a small laugh. A laugh that turned into an uncontrollable sob. Then both of them were laughing and crying at the same time. The thunderous growling in their stomachs made them pull apart from each other. Both girls looked warily over at where the tray of food sat, but their rumbling bellies settled the matter. Scrambled eggs and pancakes it is, thought Lindsay miserably, praying that this time the food wouldn't be drugged or worse, poisoned, though she doubted Shirley would have gone through all this trouble just to kill them now. Shelly and Lindsay both looked at each other before taking the first bite. "Here goes nothing," Lindsay said and began shoveling some of her eggs into her mouth. To both of their surprise, the food was good, also it seemed to not be drugged. At least, that's what they were hoping. Lindsay had first thought of not eating it at all, but realized that the only thing that would accomplish is making her weaker when Shirley came back. And she wanted to be at full strength for that. "I wonder why she's keeping us here?" Shelly asked her. Lindsay shrugged, and with her free hand reached out and wiped a bit of egg off of Shelly's cheek. An action that brought a huge smile to the other girl's face. "Look, I don't know what Shirley's got planned, but I have to believe that she would take this good of care of us if she meant to kill us," Lindsay said. "That's true," Shelly replied. "But she still drugged us, kidnapped us, and locked us in a room. So that begs the question, if she isn't going to kill us, what is she going to do with us?" Lindsay sighed and scooted to the other end of the bed to get a better look around the small room, filled with antique drawers and faded floral print wallpaper. Maybe she just wants us to help her redecorate. From the looks of things, she could sure use it. "I'm being serious," Shelly said, feeling drained. "Monsters, kidnapping. All our friends are dead or worse. We are in some really deep shit here." "I noticed," Lindsay replied. "Last time I ever leave campus again, trust me. But either way, the only thing we can do is wait. It's not like we can get through that door. There are bars on the window, and even if by some miracle we do manage to get out, we have no idea where we are or what's waiting for us outside of this house." "Like more monsters?" Shelly asked her, coming to the same conclusion Lindsay had. "Exactly," she told her. "They could be in the woods waiting for us for all we know." Shelly was about to say something else, but stopped when they heard what sounded like a thump from downstairs. Lindsay was right. She realized the only thing they could do was wait. 16. Shirley came back up and opened the door soon after that. She still had the gun on her. She made it clear that they could go to the bathroom and shower, but only one at a time. The other had to stay locked in the room. It definitely wasn't the opportunity that Lindsay had been looking for. She wasn't going to leave Shelly behind, and part of her thought that somehow the old bitch knew that. She was all smiles as she let them choose who went first. Lindsay was about to say something, but Shelly volunteered. "You can't always be the brave one," Shelly told her as she slid off the bed and followed Shirley out of the room. "I didn't realize I was," Lindsay muttered, but the only reply was the lock on the door sliding back into place. Even from where they were on the second floor, Shelly could tell the house was large. Very large. Too large, in fact, for just little old Shirley to live in all by her lonesome. Shelly thought. Lindsay had been right, though it was definitely some sort of farmhouse. She looked out every window they passed on the way to the bathroom, which was down the hall. Every view was basically the same: open fields and forests, as far as the eye could see. And in the distant mountains, she would bet her bottom dollar that the cabin wasn't far from here. Lindsay was happy when Shelly came back. The thought of being in this situation alone was more than she could handle right now. While she was in the shower, she heard Shirley talking to someone outside of the door. While she couldn't make out what they were saying, Lindsay could tell distinctly that it was definitely a male voice. So Shirley didn't live here alone after all. Despite everything else, the shower, she had to admit, it was divine, especially since she hadn't realized how much gunk she'd been covered with from running through the woods. It would have been better if Shirley hadn't locked her in as soon as the door shut. She tried her best to smile and appear friendly when she met Shirley at the door to take her back to the room. She didn't want her to know that she heard the other voice. The last thing they needed was the situation to become dangerous before it had to. Luckily, Shirley didn't bring it up either as they walked back to the room. For 2 days, that became their routine. Locked away in that room until Shirley came to bring them breakfast or dinner, or to let them out for bathroom breaks. The girls had looked at every avenue of escape. But Shirley was a pro, or whoever the other voice she heard was. They'd made it impossible to escape. Even the doorknob on their side of the room was missing. Which until this situation, Lindsay would have never considered trying to brain an old woman with a doorknob, but what was it her dad always used to say? Needs must. Something like that. They did figure out how to open the window though, not that it did them much good, but at least they could get a breeze in now and again. Which made them a little less stir-crazy. The next time Shirley came back, it was with a tray of sandwiches in tow, but they couldn't help but notice what she was carrying in her hands looked like those house arrest anklets that kids on probation used to get. Except these were bigger and looked far more sinister. Instead of just putting down the tray and leaving instead, Shirley down on the edge of the bed and beamed at them. Now, I don't want y'all to think this is a punishment. You girls have been really good these last few days. But until I know that you are couldn't try any funny business, I'm going to need y'all to wear these. She told them with a patronizing smile. Why should we? It's not like we can get out here anyway. Shelly told her. You go girl, thought Lindsay. Shirley just rolled her eyes. Well, if y'all put these on, you can have free reign in the house. But just so we understand each other, these are modified like a dog collar. If y'all try to set out from the house or the property within a certain distance, well, let's just say you're in for a real treat. Shirley replied. Now why don't y'all be good girls and put these on? Lindsay and Shelly looked at each other and shrugged. What other alternative did they have? It wasn't like they were getting out of here in any other way. At the same time, they both closed the anklets around their legs. The sound of them locking into place was ominous. Not for the first time, Lindsay and Shelly couldn't help but wonder what exactly they had done to wind up in this situation. The anklets felt like an inescapable weight on their legs. They followed Shirley out of the room tentatively. The first time they had walked out of that room without supervision in days. It was refreshing to say the least. They followed her downstairs and discovered that the house was indeed very large, but done in a very old style, still set up with parlors and sitting rooms and large fireplaces. It was like something out of one of those Southern period romances her mom liked. Only Lindsay was pretty sure that a happy ending would not be around any of these corners. Shelly knew that if she were to go outside, the house would most likely be a grand old Victorian. But that's not something she wanted to try without knowing full well what Shirley meant by little treat. Shirley led them to a grand dining room and had them help prepare the meal. It seemed like a lot of food for just the three of them. 4 if you count the mystery voice that Lindsay had heard. They brought the food out to the dining table. The girls almost dropped it, shocked to see that the table was full. All except 3 chairs. Men and women of all ages sat down the length of the long table with a muscular older man sitting at the head. Careful now. There'll be time for introductions later. Shirley clucked at them. Strangers surrounded them, except for one face they knew very well. Sitting on the left side of the table was Jerry. He was no longer a monster, but he wasn't the Jerry they remembered either. His hair was longer, mangier, and in less than a couple of days he looked like he had lost 100 pounds. He'd never been a big guy, but now he looked downright gaunt. And his eyes were yellowish and wild-looking. He was about to say something and then stopped. He looked at the man sitting at the head of the table, as though looking for permission. Neither Lindsay nor Shelly had spoken. They hadn't even moved after seeing Jerry. Now she felt her eyes pull to the figure sitting at the head of the table. He was a large older man, but Lindsay couldn't even begin to place his age. The feature that held her attention, though, was his pale, milky, and obviously blind eye. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd already seen that eye somewhere before. But that was impossible, wasn't it? Just as impossible as Jerry turning into whatever the hell that was. She reminded herself. Before she could say anything, the large man spoke up. I don't think it's time for them to eat with us yet, Shirley. He told her, not taking his eyes off the girls. Shirley simply nodded in agreement, and told them to take a little of the food up to their room and stay there until she came in tomorrow. On the way up the stairs, Lindsay and Shelly tucked away that vital piece of information that Shirley wasn't the one in charge around here. Now they just had to figure out a way to use it. 17. That was Jerry, wasn't it? Shelly asked later that night. Yeah, I think so, Lindsay replied, rolling over on her side. He's a lycanthrope or whatever the sheriff called them, isn't he? Shelly asked. Fuck if I know, Lindsay told her, but it's probably a solid bet. Do you think he's the one that killed Amy? Shelly asked her. Lindsay had tried to not to think about it, but truth be told, she'd come to the same conclusion herself. And after everything the sheriff had told them, it was the only thing that made sense. I honestly don't know, Lindsay finally replied. Both of them were silent after that, and before they knew it, they were fast asleep. The next day, Lindsay and Shelly were immediately put to work. They prepared all the meals. They cleaned the house. At one point, they even chopped firewood for the fireplace. Lindsay didn't mind though. She couldn't help but think it might come in handy to know where the axe was. Although they were pretty sure that this was just to keep them busy, since they had both spied the large monitor heaters in most of the rooms. But working had one big advantage: it allowed them to look around the property, which helped them to plan their escape. For instance, they now knew that the only vehicle on the property was Shirley's SUV, which meant that the keys would likely be on her, or somewhere in the house. They also realized that the SUV was their best choice for an escape. The property was enormous, and even if they made it through the fields into the forest, there was a good chance they'd get lost in the woods before they made it to the road. Then there were the lycanthropes to consider. After all, they had to stay somewhere nearby. Just thinking about it made Lindsay shudder. There was no way she was going to brave the woods if she didn't have to. Their biggest problem was still clasped tight around their ankles. If they couldn't figure out a way to get those things off, then it wouldn't matter if they got the keys to the SUV or not. The only problem was Shirley hadn't exactly dangled the key in front of them, so they didn't know how to take them off. After making the meal that night, they were once again sent back upstairs. Lindsay knew that besides Jerry, everyone else at that table was a bunch of serious, hard cases, who mostly only spoke in grunts and growls. Orison, the big man, was definitely in charge, however, and kept the others in line. What worried her the most was the possibility that Orison was the one with anklet keys and not Shirley. That wasn't a possibility that Lindsay wanted to consider, not without a gun anyhow. And a big gun at that. They ate in silence and then got ready for bed. It had taken them both a day or two to adjust to being sent to bed by 7. It was like being a kid again. In the most fucked up fashion possible. Lindsay reminded herself. Neither of them really had an appetite, but Lindsay had reminded Shelly that food was fuel, and when the time came, they'd need all the strength they could muster. Tonight, they hadn't even seen Jerry at the table. She'd noticed, though, that Shirley was careful not to let them close to him, even when they were setting the table. As though they were going to start tapping out Morse code or something. Lindsay tried to clear her head as they climbed into bed. She tried to remember how long they'd been here. Was it still spring break? She noticed Shelly was staring at her. What is it? She whispered to her. They'd taken to whispering when the others were in the house, just in case they could hear them. There was just too much that they didn't know. Before all of this, Lindsay would have told anyone who asked that it was impossible for a person to turn into a giant wolf creature. Now she wasn't ready to rule anything out. Shelly smiled. Nothing, she replied, reaching out and tucking one of Lindsay's hairs behind her ear. Lindsay laughed and went to pull away, not wanting a repeat of what had happened between them before the trip. Impulsively, Lindsay did the same thing back to Shelly, but let her fingers linger behind the other girl's ear and slide down her neck. Shelly muttered a contented sound, and unable to control herself, Lindsay leaned forward and kissed her. Shelly pulled away. I'm so sorry, Lindsay told her, feeling really embarrassed. It's fine, don't be. I just wasn't ready for it. Shelly told her. Lindsay, I can't do this again if you're going to hate me in the morning like last time. Lindsay knew Shelly was right. She'd treated her like shit not only the next morning but even on the trip. Even though she knew that the only reason Shelly had come was for her. And for once it was her that was at a loss for words. So instead, she let her lips do the talking. Neither one of them got much sleep that night. 18. They hadn't been asleep long when Lindsay woke up. She swore she heard someone knocking. Thump thump. There it was again. She got up and started walking bleary-eyed to the door. Thump thump. Again. This time, however, she realized it wasn't coming from the door at all, but from the window. She jumped and turned around, almost screaming, when she saw the figure illuminated against it. She stopped herself, however, when she saw who it was. Jerry? Her mind registered him groggily, and she started moving to the window even though some part of said she shouldn't. After all, she'd known him since she was a freshman. He couldn't have changed that much, right? And he looked normal enough now, she thought. Shelly woke up as she walked across the room. What's going on? She asked. It's Jerry at the window, Lindsay answered. Shelly rubbed her eyes and sat up. What does he want? Lindsay shrugged and walked over to it anyway. Jerry's eyes were still that shocking shade of yellow, as he pressed his mouth up against the glass. Open up, he mouthed. He mouthed. Lindsay opened the window, and Jerry pressed up against the bars. What do you want? She asked him. Jerry looked around and whispered. You guys need to get out of here. After tomorrow night, it's going to be too late. What's going to be too late? She asked. Everything. They've got plans for y'all, terrible fucking plans. Shirley has the keys to your anklets. Get them from her and get out of here, but whatever you do, don't come back. Don't ever fucking come back. He told them. What about you? She asked. I can't leave. I need the Wolfsbane now more than ever. He said and then shrugged. Besides, I killed Amy, I deserve this. He told them, the anguish clear in his eyes. Jerry? Lindsay started, but before she could say anything else, he was already gone. Holy shit, did he just jump off the roof? Shelly asked. I think that's the least of our worries. Whatever they got planned, we need to get the fuck out of here beforehand, Lindsay told her. Shelly nodded and lay back down. But try as she might, Lindsay couldn't get back to sleep that night. 19. Shirley came for them bright and early the next day, and try as they might, the woman gave them no opening for escape. And even worse than that, at least one of the visitors that came at night was around all day, making it impossible for her and Shelly to just rush the old woman. To make matters worse, Jerry was still out of sight, so the girls couldn't even ask him what was going on. But, just from the way Shirley and the others were behaving, it was clear that Jerry was right, something big was going to happen tonight. And whatever it was, Lindsay's gut told her she would not like it. As night fell, Shirley's guests arrived, just like every night. But this time, they all gathered in the big barn on the property. It was also the first time Shirley had allowed either of the girls to attend one of their gatherings. She came for them a little after 8. The others were waiting for them in the barn in a half circle, each one of them silently judging the girls as they walked in, as if to see if they were ready for whatever was coming next. Lindsay didn't like the looks on their faces one bit. It reeked of predatory anticipation. Like the look on the face of a lion before it tears into a gazelle. These people were freaks, she reminded herself. No, they were worse than that. Just because they didn't always look like the thing that had attacked them in the woods, that part of them was always there waiting just beneath the skin. The tall, one-eyed man, Orison, came up to her and Shelly. You two pay attention, and whatever you do, don't scream. You don't want to get the others too excited. Trust me. He told them with a wink. Lindsay gulped. Whatever she had expected to hear, that was definitely not it. The others began to take off their clothes. Shelly gasped beside her. Lindsay slipped her hand into hers to comfort her. But to be honest, she found it comforting as well. They all hummed. At least that's what she had thought it was at first. Until it got louder and louder, and she realized they were growling. Growling like animals. Growling like Charlie had when he first emerged from that back room. Orison moved out of sight and came back with a squirming mass, bundled up in burlap. With horror, the girls watched as Orison pulled the burlap away to reveal a man who was gagged and tied up like a hog. He then dragged the man into the center of the circle. Shelly gripped her hand tighter, neither one of them made a sound. He dropped the man in a heap on the ground. Then he took a long rope and tied the man's hands behind his back, connecting the other end to a wooden beam, trussing him up like a freshly killed deer. They could do nothing but watch as he stripped down. "What the fuck is going on?" Shelly asked her, the girl's eyes wide with shock and fear. There was a loud smack as Shirley's hand hit her in the back of her head. "Ladies don't talk like that, dearies," she said with a smile. "Now pay attention." They turned back in silence to the scene before them. Orison had taken some type of plant off of a table, and was passing it out amongst the now naked crowd. Lindsay recognized it from the pictures Jerry had shown him. It was Wolfsbane, that special type he'd gone on and on about, all on how it caused hallucinations. She really wished that this was just a hallucination. "Tonight we feed the beast," he told them, his voice a dry pant, but the whole time he spoke his eyes bore holes into the girls. "This helps us keep control," he told them, dangling it in front of them. "After all, we don't want to accidentally kill our new friends before we get to know them better." There was a round of guttural laughter at that which made both girls' skin crawl. She wanted to look away, but knew that if she tried to leave, both she and Shelly would pay the price. The group was now on the ground while the man tied to the beam struggled against his bonds, while he did those beneath him struggled against their flesh. Their arms broke and extended, their spines cracked as they went from a human form to a far more monstrous one. Lindsay watched as Shirley surveyed the entire scene with a maniacal smile. She realized that the smaller one, farther back from the others, was Jerry. His, however, was pained and pitiful, while the others transitioned from one form to the next. She could only watch as he struggled. It must get easier with time, she realized. Even in their beastly forms, she could still make out Orison. He was far bigger than the others and only had one good eye, but now there was no doubt. He was the one in the woods that had leapt out at Jerry. She wondered for the first time how much of this he and Shirley had planned. They had probably become targets as soon as they walked into the sheriff's station. The man on the beam looked like he was going to pass out. He had stopped struggling against his bonds, and now just stared in shock at the monsters before him. One of the smaller creatures leaped up and tore a chunk out of his leg. He screamed against the gag. She wondered for a moment if the smaller one was Jerry. Now that they were all shifted, she had trouble telling them all apart. Did it matter? After all, he was one of them now, and no amount of wishing could change that. She reminded herself, remembering his words from the other night. "I killed Amy." Lindsay felt like throwing up, as the man screamed again behind his gag. The others tore into him, but they didn't kill him. The whole scene reminded Lindsay of a documentary she had seen once about wolves, and how they ate their prey while it was still alive. The prey either died during the feeding, or whenever they delivered the killing blow. They didn't seem in a rush to end this man's misery. No, tonight they were putting on a show. Watching them, she would swear that they were taking some sort of sadistic pleasure out of slowly tearing into and eating the man. Even the creature that was Orison seemed to smile, all teeth of course. Shirley laughed out loud every now and again. Shelly gripped her hand even tighter. Lindsay saw that the other girl's eyes were locked on what was happening. She was seconds from going into shock. "Why won't they just kill him?" Lindsay begged. She looked into the man's bloodshot eyes and prayed for him to die. "Please just let this be over. For all of their sakes." As if hearing her prayer, Shirley suddenly spoke. "One of you two finish it now," she said. "What?" Lindsay asked her, shocked. Shirley snorted. "Did I stutter? Go put the poor dear out of his misery," she said, looking at Lindsay as though she had asked a dumb question. Lindsay looked at Shelly, and realized that if one of them had to do it, it would have to be her. Not doing this wasn't an option. Some part of her knew that if she didn't, they would end up as part of the night's festivities. Shirley handed her a large kitchen knife. "Don't worry about that plant. Let's them control the beast so you don't have to worry about one of them taking a chunk out of you," she said, as though that was the extent of Lindsay's problems at the moment. She walked up to the man tied to the beam. She wished she at least knew his name, but it wasn't like she could ask. He barely even resembled a human being anymore. For the life of her, she couldn't understand how anyone could take so much punishment and still hang on. "You don't have to fight anymore," she thought, hoping that he would understand. As she walked up to him, one creature came forward and pressed its nose against her stomach, sniffing her. Lindsay fought the urge to look at it. Remembering that looking in the eyes of strange dogs and other canines could trigger them to attack. She kept staring at the helpless man as the beast's hot breath whipped across her abdomen. Suddenly, Orison growled, and the creature stepped back. In fact, they all did, giving her more than enough room to step forward and look the man in the eyes. She was surprised not to see any hatred there. In fact, all that seemed to be left was the shock in the man's eyes, as though some part of him still couldn't believe this was happening. She put the knife to his throat. "Make it clean now," Shirley told her from the back where she was standing with Shelly. Her hands were on Shelly's shoulders, making it clear that if Lindsay fucked this up, both of them would pay for it. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, as though that made what she was about to do better. With tears in her eyes, she drew the blade across his jugular. Bright red blood shot out onto her face. Hot and wet. Some of it even got in her mouth, leaving a coppery, salty taste behind. It wasn't like the movies, where they just die. Instead, Lindsay could only stand there in shock as she was covered in the wriggling man's blood, and watch in horror as he gasped and struggled a little before lying still against the beam, his body slowly sagging down. "I didn't even know his name," she thought as he collapsed against his restraints, and she retched, puking up her dinner from earlier, which one of the beasts happily began to lick up, causing her to feel even sicker. She couldn't look up as they tore into the man's corpse. "And now, I'm a murderer," was the only thing she could think, as Shirley and Shelly slowly pulled her to her feet and escorted her out of the barn. The whole while Orison's one good eye was locked on her, approvingly, which only made her feel like getting sick, yet again. 20. After the feast, they were escorted back to their room by Shirley. This time she didn't even lock the door, stating that if they wanted to shower before bed, then they were welcome to. If she hadn't offered, then Lindsay had planned on asking. She figured that the only reason Shirley even offered was less for their well-being, and mostly because she didn't want them to ruin her sheets. They were both covered in blood. Lindsay looked herself over in the bathroom mirror. She was practically dripping it with it. Shelly had it on her, from where she had tried to comfort her after the incident. The murder. Lindsay reminded herself she'd murdered somebody, and then watched as a bunch of fucking hillbilly werewolves ate him. For a minute, she felt like she was going to puke again. But the last thing she wanted was one of those things coming up here to lap it up. Not like she had anything left on her stomach anyway. They quickly showered, neither one of them leaving the other alone in the bathroom, just in case Shirley was trying to split them up. After tonight, they couldn't take any more chances. It could have been them tied to that beam. Hell, it still might be if they don't get out of here soon. Lindsay reminded herself. Listening carefully, just in case, they were both surprised to find they couldn't hear anyone moving around in the house. The others were probably still out in the barn, feasting. Lindsay thought, bringing another wave of nausea to her stomach. And how many more times would they have to see that? To participate with that, if they didn't hurry up and get the fuck out of here. Lindsay knew they had to leave as soon as possible. They couldn't delay it anymore. The water cut off and Shelly climbed out. Looking at her, Lindsay knew she was thinking about the same thing. Tomorrow, they would try to escape. They couldn't put it off any longer. By the time they were both done showering, The bottom of the tub was tinged light pink. Lindsay hadn't even realized that much blood had been on her. Just thinking about it made her shudder. She would give anything just to have this nightmare be over. They climbed into the bed in complete silence. Both of them were afraid that at any moment, it could be them being dragged out to that barn to be fed to those things. Or worse, turned into one of those things and lose their humanity like poor Jerry. Lindsay wasn't 100% sure how it worked, and she didn't want to find out. "Look, we need to leave," Lindsay suddenly blurted, the sound echoing in the little room and make Shelly jump. Shelly rolled over and looked at her. "Tonight?" she asked incredulously. Lindsay shook her head and then felt stupid, knowing that Shelly probably couldn't see the gesture in the darkroom. "No, they will expect that. But we should at least plan and prepare. Tomorrow night is going to be the best time. Plus, if we are lucky, the rest of Orizin's pack will be gone back to wherever it is they go when they aren't here." Shelly started to bite her bottom lip, something that Lindsay had realized she only did when she was thinking. Lucky for her, Shelly was smart, and Lindsay wasn't afraid to admit that in most circumstances, Shelly was smarter than her. Especially when it came to keeping a cool head. "You know there's only one way we can do this," Lindsay told her. "I know, Shirley probably keeps the keys to her truck on her at all times," Shelly replied, still biting her bottom lip. "I've never seen her place them anywhere else." "Can you go through with it?" Lindsay asked her, rolling onto her side and stroking the other girl's face lightly. Shelly reached up and clutched Lindsay's hand tightly. "Let's kill this bitch," Shelly whispered. "Good. Once it's done, we are going to be looking over our shoulder the entire way back home." Shelly sat up a little. "You mean we aren't going back to the town? What about all the people those monsters have killed?" she asked. "What about them?" Lindsay groaned, more than a little frustrated. "Look at how much good that did us the first time. And besides, how do we know that everyone in town isn't in one this?" she asked. "Think about it. We're in a small town, and look at all the people who show up at Shirley's gatherings. For all we know, half the town turns into those things." "You don't really think the whole town knows about this?" Shelly asked, feeling the all-too-common rush of fear come back over her. Lindsay sighed. "Yes, but Shirley and the sheriff did, and look at what lengths she went to cover it up. Think about it. Orizin and his people live around here somewhere. Which means they have to be doing something during the day, right?" Shelly could only nod. "Exactly. So the town is out. No, we drive straight back home, way out of the reach of this hellhole. And when we get there, we ditch the truck and call 911. "Why?" Shelly asked. Lindsay smiled. The idea had just come to her a few moments ago. "Think about it. By now, people are looking for us back home. And the others are dead, so questions are going to be asked, but we can't exactly walk into a police station talking about monster wolf creatures, right?" she asked. "Yeah, I see your point," Shelly admitted. "Exactly. They would send us straight to the loony bin, and probably say we killed the others. So instead, we will tell them that we woke up with no memory of what happened in a farmhouse and that we heard screams from the barn, so we stole the truck and drove straight back home. Once they investigate it, they will find Shirley's house and whatever she doped her tea with." "But what about the others?" Shirley asked. "You mean Orizin and them?" "Well, I don't know about you, but I have a feeling in my gut that once the police start looking into things around here, they will find plenty of evidence to send them all away. But most likely Orizin and the rest of those creatures will try to fight or something, and get gunned down by the cops." "You think so?" "I mean, I hope so," Lindsay replied, smiling and running her fingers through Shelly's hair again and enjoying the sense of peace that it brought her. Just then Shelly jumped up. "What?" Lindsay asked, startled. "We need hard proof. If they kick in Shirley's door, there's no proof that we were kept here. Think about it, those things are dumb, they'll clean up what they can. Plus, if they don't, then we will have to explain Shirley's body." "What did you have in mind?" Lindsay asked. Shelly produced a rock from the pocket of her shorts and smiled. Lindsay watched the other girl work, unable to keep the smile off her own face. She almost wished she could be here and see the look on Orizen's face when the police found that. Almost. 21. It felt like they'd just fallen asleep, bundled together tightly, when Shirley started banging on the door. Not stopping until she could hear both girls getting up and moving around the little room. Rise and shine, dears. Today's a big day. Get up and make yourselves presentable. Orizen's got some big news for y'all down at the breakfast table, she said sweetly from the other side of the door. It was the same tone of voice Shirley had used when she'd made Lindsay kill that poor man. Shelly reminded herself, trembling slightly at the reminder that if everything went right today, they would have another body on their hands. At least Shirley deserved it. That thought made her feel a little better about the situation. But only a little. Do you want the bathroom first? Lindsay asked, sitting up groggily. Her hair mussed and her eyes barely open. Sure, Shelly said with a little laugh. Why don't you try to get a little more sleep? She told Lindsay, and gave her a kiss as she got up. Lindsay nodded, and by the time Shelly had made it to the door, she was already back asleep, bundled tightly in the blankets. Shelly already missed her warmth as she left the room. It seemed like she was back in no time, and then it was Lindsay's turn to leave the warmth of the bed. Back in the room, she dressed quickly, enjoying every moment of Shelly's casual staring as she did so, a faint blush already once on the other girl's face. See something you like? Lindsay asked coyly. I don't know, you might have to show me again just so I get a good look, Shelly said, rising off the bed and coming over to where Lindsay stood now fully dressed. They embraced and kissed. When we're home, Lindsay murmured, reluctant to let go of the comfort that Shelly provided. Shelly pulled away in reluctant agreement. I can't wait. Then you know what we have to do, Lindsay told her, needing to hear her say it one more time. I know, Shelly told her, her hand trailing down Lindsay's neck and across her stomach, tickling her slightly. This time Lindsay was the one to pull away, as she pulled on a shirt. Good. Then let's get this shit over with and get the hell out of here. Downstairs at the table, Orizen was waiting for them. He was smiling crookedly at them. His teeth looked like they were too large to be in his mouth. As he shoveled pancakes into them, Lindsay couldn't help but think it was because those teeth were better suited to tearing flesh. From the look that he gave them as they sat down at the table, it was clear that he felt the exact same way. Unlike Jerry, Orizen was a killer through and through. The change didn't make him that way. It just helps him embrace it. Shirley rushed in and placed a plate of steaming hot plate of food in front of each of them, giving them grandmotherly pats on the head as she did so. Good morning, dears, tuck in now, she told them. Y'all are going to need your strength. That's right, Orizen told them. Tonight's going to be a big night. Shelly and Lindsay looked at each other from across the table. What do you mean? Shelly asked. Shirley drifted until she was standing behind Orizen, her hand on his shoulder in support. Tonight's the night y'all join the family, she told them. Orizen nodded. There's a full moon tonight, the best time for the first change. Harder to fight the beast, it practically rips out your skin, he told them as he plunged his fork down into a runny sunny side-up egg. How does that happen? Lindsay asked, no longer feeling hungry in the slightest. Orizen laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. Bite's the quickest way. Sometimes too much of the Wolfsbane can bring it about too. Especially when the moon's full, your little friend found that out the hard way. Claw, blood, the usual methods, he added with a leer in Shelly's direction. Both girls swallowed. Orizen jumped up suddenly and headed towards the door. I got to go. That new pups have been giving me trouble lately. Jerry. Lindsay and Shelly realized at the same time as they watched him walk out of the door. Eat up, Shirley told them mercurially as she walked out of the doorway, leaving them alone in the dining room. Shelly turned to Lindsay. She shook her head and made a shushing gesture. Now wasn't the time to talk too loudly. Shirley was without a doubt waiting for them to finish breakfast in the next room. Lindsay and Shelly ate in silence, which mostly involved pushing their food around to make it look as though they'd eaten more than they had. "Do you want me to?" Shelly asked. For a moment, Lindsay thought about it. Then she shook her head. The last thing she wanted to do was chicken out and let Shelly have to make the hard call. Besides, Lindsay already had blood on her hands. What would a little more hurt at this point? She walked into the kitchen holding their plates. Shelly was still in the dining room, waiting for the inevitable. In the kitchen, Shirley was standing by the sink rinsing food off of Orizen's plates and washing the cookware. "Think about it, girl. Soon you'll be part of the family. Ain't that something?" she said. "Sure is," Lindsay replied, surprised at how calm she felt as her bare feet walked across the cold hardwood floor. The smells of cooked bacon and coffee was still in the air as she put the dirty dishes, picking up a steak knife that was still covered in butter and syrup at the same time. "Y'all be like my little daughters," Shirley went on. "All I ever had was Orizen and the rest. No daughters though, that's what the pack really needs. It'll even them out, calm them down, you know. Of course, the first few litters youngins will be hard on you girls. Always is, but after that, it's easy going." "First few litters?" Lindsay asked, trying to wrap her head around what Shirley had just said. "Of course. Why do you think we kept you around?" Shirley asked, as though it were obvious. "That's what the pack needs, new blood. I'm too old, plus I was never turned. Used to be they didn't turn the girls, but the younger generation hasn't got the same grit as mine does. The other girls we brought out here, well, they didn't survive birthing their first litter. So that's why y'all get the honor of being turned. Truth be told, I'm a little jealous of y'all." She was still talking when Lindsay spun around and plunged the steak knife into the side of her neck. Blood spurted out and splashed on her face, making her want to retch. Shirley cried out in pain and shock. Turning to Lindsay, her hands reaching out like claws, tried to grab at her. She tried to push her back, but even after dying, Shirley was strong. The old woman was trying to talk, but her words couldn't get around the knife in her throat. Not knowing what else to do, Lindsay grabbed at the knife, which was slippery with blood and sticky with maple syrup. She began to almost saw it in and out of the wound, stabbing Shirley again and again with a motion like she was cutting steak. The serrated edges doing all the work as it cut through Shirley's jugular. The sound of the blade tearing through it, echoing out of her still gaping mouth and promising to haunt Lindsay's dreams for as long as she lived. Blood covered Lindsay and the rest of the kitchen, but she didn't stop sawing until Shirley's eyes rolled up in her head and she was dead on the floor. Lindsay followed her down as she fell, her hand still on the knife. Shirley's head barely hung on to what was left of her neck. She couldn't believe how close she'd come to decapitating her. "Is it done?" Shelly's voice called out from the other room. Lindsay felt like she was going to be sick. The taste of bacon and pancakes rose in her throat, hot with stomach acid, but she pushed it back down. She would not lose her shit again. She couldn't, not now. "It's done," she answered, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. Now it was time to get the hell out of here. 22. The keys to Shirley's SUV were in her pocket, and the keys to the anklets were around her neck. Hearing the click as the anklets dropped off their feet made both girls feel lighter. Or at least freer. Now they just had to get out of here before Orizen came back and found them stooped over Shirley's dead body. Shelly was doing her best not to look at the huddled corpse of the woman who had kept them locked away for almost a month. Someone she'd thought was powerful now seemed like nothing more than an old woman. Aged and defeated. "Come on," Lindsay said, making Shelly tear her attention away from the rapidly cooling body. She slipped her arm around her and guided her out of the room. The SUV was out front. "Wait," Shelly said as they were about to walk out the front door. "What?" Lindsay asked, doing her best to keep her cool. They were, after all, on a tight timeline here. "We need to go out to the barn," Shelly told her. "Why?" Lindsay asked incredulously. Shelly pulled away from her and put her hands on her hips. We need to try to save Jerry if we can. We don't even know if he's out there, Lindsay argued. I know that, but the barn is where the others all hang around. So it makes sense that he might be out there. She shot right back. He wouldn't leave us behind. Lindsay groaned. She wasn't so sure about that. Fine. They ran out the back door instead, making a beeline straight to the barn. The barn where they'd been party to murder, and an all too gruesome feast. Would Jerry even want to come with them, after eating someone? Lindsay gulped as another thought took her. What would they do if Jerry just saw them as another meal? The barn looked even more sinister in the daylight, and they slowed their pace before going inside. They'd never seen it up close in the daylight before. It seemed to be made of mostly rotting wood, held together with old paint and rusted hinges, which squeaked as they opened the door, making Lindsay wince as she thought about how good canine hearing was. If there were any of the wolf creatures in the area, then they defiantly knew that the girls were walking into the barn, where they would be trapped like fish in a barrel. Jerry? Shelly called out, making Lindsay jump. Shush. Lindsay motioned and grabbed her. Shelly pushed her off. I'm trying to get his attention. We don't know that he's here, Lindsay told her, looking around at the dark interior of the barn. Besides, if he is, then he knows. She was about to turn to go, when her eyes saw something sitting on a table in the back. A shotgun, nothing fancy, just an old pump action. Lindsay would bet money that it was a 12 gauge, just like her grandfather had taught her how to shoot when she was younger. There was only one problem: it was on the other side of the barn. And they still weren't sure they were alone in here. Stay here, Lindsay told Shelly. What are you going to do? What you wanted, look for Jerry. Plus, I'm going to grab that gun, Lindsay explained. She dug into her pockets and handed Shelly the car keys. Why are you giving me these? She asked, wide-eyed. If something grabs me, don't be a hero. Get out of here, Lindsay told her. Before Shelly could talk her out of it, she walked straight into the darkened barn. She was near halfway into the room when she heard the rattle of chains against the concrete floor. The sound brought back memories of fence hopping as a teenager, and the awful sound of a dog charging, pulling at the end of its chain. Muscle memory took over, and she jumped forward, landing heavily into something sticky. Lindsay, are you okay? Shelly shouted, having heard the noise. Just peachy, Lindsay called out. When she looked up, she stared into a set of yellow eyes. Even in the dim light, she could tell it was Jerry. He was still in a mostly human form, all except his eyes and his teeth. Teeth which were now so large and jagged he couldn't close his mouth. Easy now, Jerry, she said, putting her hands out in front of her like he was a rabid dog. In many ways he was, she told herself. He pulled harder against the heavy chain that was clasped around his neck. Jerry wasn't going anywhere, anytime soon. She told herself, walking slowly backward, not wanting to turn her back on the bloodthirsty creature that used to be her friend. She tried not to think about what she'd fallen in, but when she reached the shotgun, the sunlight through the cracks let her showed her. Lindsay had fallen in the still drying puddle of blood from the night before. Her heart pounded as the image of her hand pulling the knife across the stranger's throat flashed before her eyes. Jerry growled low in his throat. Excited by her fear and driven by hunger, he charged his chains a couple more times, choking himself and sending himself sprawling on the ground. Pull your shit together, Lindsay told herself as she picked up the shotgun and filled her pockets with shells from a box on the table. She'd been right. It was a 12 gauge. Now she just needed to get out of the barn. Jerry blocked the most direct route. Lindsay put the stock firmly in her shoulder and widened her stance, just like her grandfather had taught her. Then she brought the small bead at the end of the barrel down, until it sighted directly between Jerry's yellow eyes. Her finger was steady on the trigger, but in the end, she couldn't pull it. With a heavy sigh, she let the shotgun fall away to her side and walked into the darker areas of the barn. Killing Jerry at this point may have been doing him a favor, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She had enough blood on her hands, she just couldn't add his to it. Not today, anyway. Once she got to the doorway, Shelly pulled her into a tight embrace. "That was Jerry in there, wasn't it?" "Not anymore," Lindsay told her. Looking back, she could still feel the yellow eyes of the beast leering at her from the darkness, even if she could no longer see them. The thought of it made a chill run up her spine. Shelly was about to say something else when the howling began. 23. Shelly froze when she heard the howls, but Lindsay pushed her into the passenger seat and ran to the other side of the SUV. Without waiting to see if anything had emerged from the woods, she put the keys in and threw the SUV into gear. The back tires threw gravel every which way as they rocketed up the driveway. Shelly was thrown back into her seat, but to her, it was a small price to pay to watch the house disappear in the rearview mirror. As they turned onto the old blacktop road, Lindsay turned right, knowing that was the way she had seen Orison and them take when leaving. One creature was in the road in front of them, howling its head off. If it thought that was going to make her stop the truck, it was wrong. Dead wrong. With a whimpering squeal, the creature went under the truck's tires. The impact of running over it threw the girls around inside the truck, but they drove on. Lindsay's foot, jamming the pedal down as far as it would go. They could hear more howls now. In the side mirrors, they could only watch as shapes began emerging from the forest and giving chase to the truck. Even with the truck tearing down the road at a breakneck pace, the heavily muscled beasts were not far behind. "Don't stop," Shelly whispered as though she were afraid to say it any louder. As if the words themselves could slow the vehicle down. Lindsay's hands were slick with sweat as she gripped the cracked leather steering wheel of the old truck as her foot pressed down as hard as it could on the sticky pedal. The truck revved and lurched towards the creatures, its engine chugging down the blacktop and carrying them with it. Shelly prayed and almost closed her eyes. Suddenly, one of the creatures emerged from the side of the woods. She tried to swerve and avoid it, but the creature lunged and used its long claws to pull itself onto the hood of the moving vehicle. Lindsay kept the pedal down. She couldn't see past the monster on the hood. The fully changed lycanthrope looked at them, spitting and snarling. It sank one clawed hand into the truck's hood after the other, dragging its way toward the cab. If it got its feet into the grill, then they would be in real trouble. "Shelly, I need you to handle that," Lindsay said, trying to sound soothing and doing her best to keep her voice even. Knowing that the last thing they needed right now was to panic. Shelly took a deep breath, and without looking towards her, Lindsay heard the catch of her seatbelt being released. The beast moved another couple inches towards them as it did its best to hang on, while Lindsay swerved left and right, hoping to shake it from the hood. From the way its lower body was dangling, it was angling to get a toehold. Shelly knew it was now or never. The air screamed into the cab of the SUV as Shelly put down the window. The beast was still snarling and snapping, its face split by a lurid grin, as if it could already taste them. She angled herself out the window. The shotgun was heavier than she expected, and she almost dropped it as she leaned out the window. Then she got it upright, tucked snugly into her shoulder, and drew a bead on the creature's head as it neared the windshield. The beast finally looked over at Shelly and froze. There was a thunderous boom and the smell of burnt black powder. Shelly was thrown hard against the door. The windshield was covered in gore from where the creature's head had exploded when hit. Lindsay turned on the wipers. Shelly rubbed her shoulder. There was a big bump as the body of the beast slid off the hood and rolled under the truck. "Happy?" Shelly asked, wishing her ears would stop ringing. Lindsay was about to respond when the back glass of the truck suddenly imploded on them. Clawed hands swung inward, and one creature pulled itself into the back of the SUV. Lindsay tried to keep the truck steady, but as the beast got closer, she lost control of the vehicle when the front wheel hit the grass. The entire world was suddenly spinning, and the last thing she saw before the world went black was the steering wheel. She came to a few minutes later. The world was still spinning, and something was trickling down her face. Blood, she thought. Mine? Her ears were ringing louder than ever, and then acrid smoke still filled the cab and something else. Something animal. She tried to turn her head. It hurt. Not her neck but her head. Concussion, she thought. At least her neck was fine. She hoped everything else was too, and wondered how hard her head had bounced off the steering wheel. Small victories, she thought groggily. No. Can't. Blackout. She all but screamed out loud. She forced herself to turn and look at Lindsay, to see if she was okay. But what she saw at first made little sense. Where Shelly had been sitting, there was now a large wolf creature, except its head was pulped from a gunshot, or maybe the accident. The seat next to her was covered in blood and gore. Lindsay realized with horror that she was covered in it. Using her hand and touching her head, she also found a small gash on her forehead. What had her dad called head wounds in the That's right, gushers. For some reason that made her laugh a little, which made her laugh almost hysterically, until she had tears streaming down her face. She took a couple of deep breaths, and made sure the rest of her body was working like it was supposed to. Then she turned back to the creature. Its whole lower body was practically shredded. It had to be the one that went under the truck. It must have pulled itself up the bumper while they were dealing with its friend. She realized. Tough bastard. At least it was dead now. But the others were still alive. How many, she didn't know. What she knew, however, was that the truck was fucked. They weren't going anywhere in the SUV anytime soon. Slowly, she pushed open her door. It protested and groaned, but with effort the door finally swung open. This old truck was done. That was for sure, at least the airbags hadn't gone off. She leaned against the truck and walked around the back, circling it towards the passenger side and trying not to pass out again. Smoke rose freely from the smashed and dented hood. When she got there, the only sign of Shelly was the hole in the windshield. Damn. She must have been thrown out. But how far? She wondered, looking around the woods, which was getting darker and darker as the sun went down. A couple of steps in front of the torn and twisted hood, she found the shotgun. It was close to the enormous tree that had stopped the truck. Beyond the tree was a gully. Shelly had to be down there, but even from where she stood, she couldn't see clearly through the foliage. Using whatever trees and bushes she walked by as supports, Lindsay slowly made her way down the hill to the girl she loved, and this time she wasn't ashamed to admit that. 24. What happened? Shelly thought as she cracked open her eyes and found herself alone in the woods. The last thing she remembered was that thing crashing through the back glass of the truck, then crawling over the seats towards them. And the tree. She remembered the tree getting larger and larger in front of them, as they ran off the road and spun out of control. Everything after that was blank. She struggled against nausea and throbbing pain in her head. Looking around, she saw she was lying at the bottom of a gully. She must have rolled down the hill. She was covered in mud and broken glass. When she tried to move, and was rewarded by a terrible pain in her left arm. Twisting around to look at it, she realized it was at an odd angle. Biting back a wave of nausea, Shelly used her other hand to tuck her broken arm against her body, biting off tears of pain the whole time. Carefully using just her legs, she could force herself to stand. All that time at the gym finally paying off. If she wasn't in so much pain, she would have laughed. Blood trickled down her face and arms, from a multitude of minor cuts and gashes. Shelly had to fight the urge to sit back down and pick the glass out of her hair. But she knew it would only make everything worse. Much worse. Was Lindsay okay? She couldn't help but wonder, staring up the gully and trying to figure out the best way to climb it. Or if she was even facing the right direction of the accident. Navigation had never been her thing. What if that creature was still up there with her? Fuck, what could she even do about it? Run up there and hit it with her broken arm? Her train of thought was suddenly sidetracked, as something rustled through the bushes as it made its way down the gully. Something or someone was coming from the wreck. And they were coming straight for her, she realized, feeling that all too familiar wave of fear as it engulfed her. Letting her broken arm swing down, she picked up a stick to use against whatever came down the hill. Fat lot of good it would do her, though. Even so, she had decided that she was going to go down fighting. The pain of her arm being jostled was almost enough to cause her to black out. Almost. The bushes in front of her rustled as something emerged. Shelly almost whooped for joy. It was Lindsay. She was just as beaten up as Shelly, but nothing looked broken. Her beautiful honey gold hair was now matted with blood from a gash on her head. "It's not all mine," she said, catching Shelly staring. "And please, tell me you aren't going to hit me with that stick. My head is already pounding," she joked. Shelly blushed, realizing that she was still holding the stick, ready to swing. She dropped it down to her side, not quite ready to let go of it completely. Then Lindsay rushed forward, crushing Shelly in a tight embrace which Shelly returned with her one good arm, not caring for the moment how much it hurt the broken one. After they pulled apart, Lindsay took off her shirt and used it to make a makeshift sling for Shelly's arm. The pain had dulled down some, now that it wasn't swinging freely. And the sight of Lindsay half naked hadn't hurt either. They had to get out of here before those things found them, she reminded herself. A howl broke the silence of the forest. They tensed and listened. Lindsay brought out the shotgun she had picked up at the accident. Shelly made a move for it, but realized she wouldn't be much good with it, only one-handed. She smiled at Lindsay apologetically. "You don't get to have all the fun," Lindsay told her with a wink. They sat straining to listen for other howls. But none came. If there was another creature in the forest after them, at least for now, it was only one. One they could fight without the fear of being ganged up on. Hell, they had already killed two. What was one more? She told herself, doing her best to boost her confidence. But alone in the woods, with just the two of them already beaten to hell from the accident, Lindsay was really feeling like the odds were against them. The howl came again. This time it was closer. They tried to look for some place to hide, but the only place was up. And there was no way Shelly was going to climb a tree with her arm, and Lindsay wasn't strong enough to pull her up either. And Lindsay had a bad feeling that these fuckers would climb if they had to. These ones weren't like Jerry or Charlie. They had been like this for a while, long enough to learn control, and they wouldn't rush the kill. No, this son of a bitch would hunt them, quietly and efficiently. She wondered if it was still trying to take them in alive, but after killing two of its friends, she honestly doubted that. Still, it was coming at them in the woods. There was nothing left for them to do. Nowhere left for them to hide. Suddenly it jumped out copse of trees and charged them. Growling and slobbering all at the same time. It charged at Lindsay with murder in its eyes. But just as she steeled herself to take the blow, it wasn't there. She opened her eyes and there it was, rolling on the ground with Shelly. It had her arm in its mouth. Blood ran freely onto the dry leaves from where the beast's teeth had sunk in. Lindsay aimed the shotgun at the creature and pulled the trigger, only to be rewarded with a clicking sound. The gun was jammed. Not knowing what else to do, she butted the beast in the back with the stock of the shotgun. But the only thing that seemed to accomplish was to make it dig into Shelly even more. She dropped her gun and jumped on its back, digging her fingers into the thing's eyes. That finally made it let go of Shelly's arm, as it howled again in pain. Lindsay wasn't done, not yet. She dug in until she felt the eye burst, and its jelly run freely down her hands. The beast whimpered and fell, trying to clutch at its ruined face with its clawed hands. "Lindsay, move!" Shelly yelled. She rolled out of the way. And as soon as she did, a thunderous boom filled the air. The surrounding forest filled with the acrid stink of black powder as the beast lay still, its breath coming in shallow gurgles. A gaping hole punched through its throat. Shelly was still on the ground. She'd gotten the gun and sat up, using her broken arm to prop it up. Lindsay walked over and helped her up, then she took the gun from her and walked over to the creature. Putting her foot on the remains of its throat, she chambered the next shell and blew the creature's head straight from its shoulders. Then they helped each other to the road. A lone car was winding its way down the road. It had out-of-state plates, so the girls figured it would be safe enough to flag down. The family inside took one look at the bloody and wounded girls, and agreed to take them anywhere they needed to go. As they entered the car, they heard howls far off in the distance. It looked like they had gotten away just in time. Epilogue. Sitting in her apartment, Lindsay and Shelly were snuggled up watching the news. On it, the anchor was standing in front of an all-too-familiar house, talking about a raid at a farmhouse where police say the owners were kidnapping and killing people and sometimes feeding them to large dogs. They showed both Lindsay and Shelly's pictures, stating that it was by their bravery the whole thing got brought to light. They cuddled together on the couch as they watched. Lindsay nuzzled her, careful of the other girl's sling. Orison, that cocky bastard, had let the investigators inside. He had cleaned the whole place, probably figured they wouldn't find a thing. Except, the news anchor went on, when they came to the room where the girls were held. Under a chest of drawers, they had found a crude carving of a flower left by one of the victims. A clue which they had related to the police beforehand. They rolled more pictures which showed Jerry, Amy, Charlie, and the sheriff. Plus the guy they had made Lindsay kill in the barn. A rolling list of victims whose true story would never be told. Lindsay thought, feeling a little sick, looking at the faces of her friends. For the first time she wondered what had happened to Jerry. He wasn't found with the others when the police raided the barn. One good thing had happened though. Orison, once it was clear that they had him red-handed, had gone out suicide by cop. The news anchor related in a somber tone. Most of the others that were with him went the same way. Both girls, however, felt relieved. Now they wouldn't have to sit across from him in a courtroom and relate their tale. After all, if he had turned into a monster in there, they would have been screwed. The newsman stated they were still uncovering bodies around the farm. The FBI is now labeled the crime scene as the work of a family of serial killers. Some people were already relating Orison and his followers to the Manson family. Do you think they'll ever find out the truth? Lindsay asked, playing with a piece of Shelly's hair. Shelly kissed her. Even if they did, they'd never believe it. True, Lindsay replied, happy that it was all finally over and things could go back to normal. While Lindsay ran out to pick up some stuff for dinner, Shelly took a shower, careful not to get her cast wet. Something about the warm water cascading over her made her feel better. She'd been having trouble sleeping ever since they'd been back. At least I haven't lost my appetite. If anything, it's gotten better. A side effect she chalked up to being forced to eat 3 enormous meals a day by Shirley. She checked the wound on her arm. It had taken over 40 stitches to close up, but it seemed to be healing fine. The doctors told her she was lucky. If an artery had been hit, she would have died on right there in those woods. Lucky, that's me, she thought, as she wiped steam away from the mirror. She'd been worried about the bites, remembering what happened to Charlie, but nothing had happened yet. And he had changed that night. It had been almost more than a week since they'd been back, so she and Lindsay were pretty sure she was in the clear. Is it just me or my eyes getting yellowish? She said out loud to no one in particular, as she wrapped a towel tightly around herself. Looking closer in the mirror, they definitely looked that way. Probably just my imagination, she figured, and went back out into the living room to wait for Lindsay to return.